All right, I guess we'll get started. Wow, I like that. I'm Thierry Hébert. So I'll also introduce David Thomas. He's going to come up after me. We sort of set the ball in motion to have the symposium. We'd like to thank you all for coming, and I see we have a nice spectrum across both. Well, I know we had people from 3 of the 4 universities in Montreal coming, but across the career spectrum, assistant, associate, and full. And I also noticed that some students and postdocs were attending, and I think we all agree that the students and postdocs are the ones who are most going to be affected by what we do. But on the other hand, they're going to be the ones who I think we're counting on to kind of convince the young Trudeau government that investing in science is an investment in you as well. So we called it the MAUT Symposium on the Naylor Report, and I'd just like to thank a few sponsors. Of course, MAUT was kind enough to not say no when David told me that we were going to organize this. We also like to thank the Faculty Club because they provided the venue, and the Faculty of Medicine, our Dean David Eilman contributed quite a bit of funding toward this, as did the MUHC-RI, so the Research Institute of the Montreal University Healthcare, the McGill University Healthcare Research Institute, gee whiz, Center Research Institute, you think I should know that, huh? And the University of Montreal contributed as well, and McGill, our principal, contributed, and also 4 basic biomedical science departments so the Department of Anatomy and Cell Biology, you can see they're alphabetical, not in order of my preference, the Department of Human Genetics, the Department of Microbiology and Immunology, and my own department, Pharmacology and Therapeutics. So I'd like to thank everyone who sponsored this. It's meant to be the beginning of a series of ongoing events, maybe not like this, but just ways that we can organize to get the recommendations of the Naylor Report implemented. So just a plan of the day's events. You've already had arrival registration and coffee, so David and I will give some opening remarks, and then we'll ask, if he comes back, Jim Widget, there he is, to give us what we're going to call a keynote address. I guess a 30-minute keynote is not really a keynote, but and then we're going to have 2 panel commentaries. Now, we've tried to kind of go across the career level spectrum. We've tried to go across, we've tried to reach, gender equity, et cetera, and we tried to reach people who are funded by SSHRC, NSERC, and CIHR. So in between those 2 panel commentaries, we'll have a break, and then we'll have an open discussion, and then we'll wrap it up with kind of thinking about the way forward. And then we'll have lunch. So lunch will be, I think, upstairs, but you'll probably be able to eat down here. So what we're after today, I suppose, when David and I arranged this, we think, how can we engage federal politicians and ministries to see that the recommendations of the Naylor Report are implemented? And I think as a partner in this, we have to better engage the public to understand, to recognize the value of basic research. And then what skill sets, what partners do we need to see aims 1 and 2 accomplished? And for me, the partners, of course, are the general public, our industry partners, and students. And I think we have to engage all of those people to convince the government that something has to be done. All right, so I won't spend too much time going on. I just want to introduce our panelists. I kind of introduced Jim. And we also have Dr. Kristen Beitz from the University of Ottawa, Dr. Nathalie Granvaux from University of Montreal, Dr. Rob Annan, who's a fellow of the Public Policy Forum of Canada. I hope I have that right, but we think that we really need to engage people who are already good at engaging government to at least get them to discuss this. One replacement, Dr. Audrey Moores, had a scheduling conflict, and I was very happy to see that Dr. Janine Mazarol was able to fill in for her from the Department of Chemistry here at McGill. Dr. Thomas Deschênes, Department of Biochemistry, Michael Hendricks, who, if anybody's on Twitter, I mean, you're going to follow Michael and you're going to follow Jim because they're highly active. Then the same with Christian Baron from the Vice Décanat à la Recherche et le Développement at the University of Montreal. He's also a big force on Twitter, I have to say. And then Renee Sieber from the Department of Geography in the School of the Environment. She will also be, and she from McGill University. She'll also be one of our panelists. So, if I were to tell panelists what to do, I would just say try not to speak for more than 5 or 8 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to discussion. And the idea, of course, is to develop strategies for the aims 1 and 3 that I spoke of earlier. We're going to record the symposium, and we plan to make it available on YouTube. And just a couple of things, if you haven't seen it already, the Summer of Science, that was, I think, put together by one of the first groups who met to talk about implementing the Naylor Report at the University of Toronto. Michael might be able to say a bit more about this, but a lot of what we hope to be able to do and how to engage your Member of Parliament and the various politicians, there's some really good things in there about how to do that. And if you haven't seen the Naylor Report itself, that's the second link. And I will make these slides available to everyone who registered by the end of the day. I think that's all I have to say. So from now, I'll invite David up to say a couple of words, and then we'll get started.
Okay. So thank you so much, Terry. So I don't have that much to say except welcome to McGill, bienvenue à McGill. But I just wanted to say what I hope would come out of today would be some sort of strategies that we can employ to go forward and show the taxpayer, our politicians, and the value of research, of fundamental research. The Naylor Report, of course, does a lot of this. It's 270-odd pages of really interesting stuff. But in the end, to implement it, to get it implemented, is going to rely on a lot of effort from the community. There are lots of competing requests for money out there. The journalists, for example, there was a $350 million request being put in. The way that budgets are formed is that when Parliament returns in September, right now the bureaucrats are working on it, the budget, there are several meetings and consultations, and the budget will be formed for next February, sometime in the September, October, November, those 3 months. So one other question that, have we lost our credibility by overpromising? Have we overpromised? Have we allowed another cure for whatever the disease you want to appear? In our enthusiasm, do we need a better way of communicating with the public, a more realistic way? And who can best argue for our research? Now, if Harold Varmus, for example, in the United States, when he wanted money for the NCI, he actually asked the pharmaceutical executives to go in and make to Congress his argument for him. We don't have a pharmaceutical, I'm talking especially about biomedical research, we don't have those sorts of large pharmaceutical companies still in Canada who can now carry the load of credibility and argue for increased funding. Is it going to be our grad students and undergraduate students for the future of the country? I hope we can discuss this. And what's the best ways to inform and dialogue with politicians? Lots of us do it. My suggestion is join a political party. And why have the tri-councils lost the confidence of government? It's very noticeable in the last budget, none of them got an increase. Why is this so? And then can we in some way coordinate our responses? We need a diversity of responses. I think we don't need one solid let's say, postcard writing campaign. How can we have a diversity of responses to politicians, but somehow coordinate these across the country? There's similar meetings going on right now in UBC, and there's going to be, I think, one in Alberta. So thank you. And our first panel, can they come up, please? It's going to be Jim. Sorry, yes, that's right.
I'll go home now.
You go home. Okay.
Thanks for that non-introduction, David. Okay, so you just plug that in. Great. So I'm the cheap version, actually not cheap, but I'm the alternative version of David Naylor. As some of you may know, we organized, Imogen Coe and I organized a meeting in Toronto the end of May. Hey, voila. A little smaller. And at the end of May, because we felt that this report, when it came out, was exceptional in terms of the quality, but it needed pushing down the hill, or pushing up the hill, actually, to be more accurate. And so we organized this meeting. There were about 190 or so people came, and it was streamed. David's presentation was streamed, as were others, and there were about 200 or so people online as well. So what I've done is I've cheated. What I've done is actually I've stolen some of David's slides, not all of them, and I've bastardized them to bring them sort of up to date or to add some color commentary. But I'm using his slides as a framework because, number one, this is from the mouth of the I guess the president of or the chair of the panel, but also, and he's very, very careful with his words, but also because his slides actually didn't do what he said really justice, and I'll come back to that and explain what I mean by that in a few slides. Because I think the tone has changed since the report was released on April 10th. So this was the panelists, very, very good, obviously university administrative heavy group, but also very, very good group. And they were tasked, and this is one of Kirsty Duncan's, it was in her letter of whatever it's called. Mandate, that's right, from the Prime Minister. One of those tasks was to create the Office of the Chief Science Advisor. Another was to conduct a review of fundamental science in Canada. And this is the first review, comprehensive review, for about 40 years. So Chapter 1, I think it is, gives a fantastic history of the past 100 years of science in Canada. And then Chapter 2 talks about the role of fundamental science and fundamental research. And David made the point that although the mandate was circumscribed around basic or fundamental science, they didn't limit themselves to that because we don't live in a vacuum. And so they were taking into consideration the other funding sources, but they knew that their mandate was really only to discuss the best ways forward for fundamental science. But of course, in part, that is better alignment with applied research and other government agencies. The other aspect of this, of course, is to do with government funding, federal funding, and so they focus very much on those vehicles, but again, recognizing there is an environment which is outside of government as well. And so Kirsty Duncan, who wasn't actually at the presentation where the report was released, which is a little bit of a worry at the start, which is because it was just literally next door at the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa, was the person to whom the report was presented. So this is the slides adapted from David. So this is the basic setup for the panel, and they worked over a period of about just over a year. And there was some delay in the release. It was pretty obvious why there was a delay in the release, because the report was largely, I think, finalized at the end of 2016, but it had a budget ask, and it was very clear it was going to have a budget ask, and so it came out after the budget, and I don't think that was surprising at all, because, as David mentioned, budgets are organized and formulated in the fall, and although I did note that the AI initiative there were meetings in January and February, and then it got incorporated into the March budget. And that was a significant chunk of money. Anyway, So the mandate questions were, are there any program gaps? And I'm putting this up simply because this report is very long. It has 35, thank you. This is Terry. It's very long, but it actually is quite focused in what it was asking. Are there any gaps? And I'll come back to the gaps in the ecosystem. And then there's another element here. I've got to keep remembering this. There's lots of recommendations in this report, 35, but there's only one which the government really pushes back on, which is the one which asks for money. So you could actually, the government could turn around and actually implement, which would be great, 34 of the 35 recommendations, and we'd still be in trouble. And there are other elements of the programming features in other countries. So they compared what we're doing in Canada with other countries, which makes sense as well. I wish the IHR had done that. I also noticed that most of the sponsorship for this is in the biomedical and health research areas. This report very, very much is looking at all areas of research supported by government, social science, NSERC, SHIRC, and CFI, as well as other more niche programs. And they did a really good job, I think, in consulting. They had a lot of workshops, they had a lot of meetings, and they incorporated, you can tell they incorporated a lot of that feedback because they even, this is esoteria to its extreme, but I have a particular bugbear about the Canadian Commons CV, and it made it into the report. And when I was talking to David, actually, before the report panel was, the report was released, he said, "You'd be happy to know there's something in there about the Canadian Commons CV." And I said, "Why is that? Why is that?" He said, "Is that because of what I wrote in my letter?" He said, no, I had to fill one in. So, experience is, okay. So these are the findings. So I think this was very, very, very important. So we often talk about, and David mentioned this too, that we punch above our weight in science in Canada compared with the world. We may have done that in the past, and it's not necessarily good that we are punching above our weight. We should be punching at our weight, and our weight should be commensurate to the importance of science in Canada. And that's the disconnect. We shouldn't be doing this, trying to do this cheaply necessarily, but it should be effective. So they actually engaged a company, which is Clarivate, which bought Web of Science, which was owned by Reuters, to do a lot of analytics and look at the ranking, various rankings of science. So how is Canada performing? And what they found is over the past 10 years, our ranks have slipped. Not enormously, they've gone from 7 to 9 in some, and they've dropped in others. But the trends are all there. Okay? And if you think about when things started to get very, very tight in terms of funding, the tightness started around 2007, and then of course we had the recession in 2009, and we've never wanted to look back. So they noted this, and they documented how our competitors has been eroded, especially compared with countries like China, India, and other, I don't know if you call them developing countries, but they're countries which have been putting much, much more effort into increasing their science budgets. And it's paying off. If you read Nature or whatever, you see this in terms of the quality of science coming out of those countries. And so they noticed this flatlining, and this is the total spend in R&D funding. This is in the higher education sector only. And they also talked about this. I won't go into details, but there's this statistic called HERD, which this government and previous governments have talked about how well we do as a G7 country in terms of our HERD, which is higher education, research and development spend. And they burst that bubble, in essence, and Rob Annan may talk about this later. They burst that bubble because actually a lot of that is not from the federal governments. It's actually, a lot of it comes from the universities and the provinces funding those universities. So although we do well, we're not comparing apples to apples there. So here's the federal spend, that's the total, and the ones, you can see that everything's flatlined. This is all in constant dollars, I think. No, actually, I think this is real dollars. So anyway, they recognize there's a funding problem, as that was not exactly a revelation to anybody, but they also back that up with what is the consequence of that? If we're punching above our weight, then maybe you can trim off some fat here and there, and we can still keep punching. I think we're punching now below the belt. They spent a lot of time, and there's a whole chapter on this in terms of governance, and I think this was to address this mandate issue, which was, are there any gaps? And I think again, they're reflecting a lot of the feedback they were given. So if you look in Canada at the number of mechanisms we have to support science at the federal level, it's nuts compared with, say, the US or other G7 countries at least. And as a consequence, there's a lack of coordination. What they didn't recommend, and I think it was wise, they didn't recommend that any of those existing niche funding vehicles be folded in. And I think that was because they were worried that you do that, you sunset those organizations, you actually also sunset the money, and it can go into a new F-35 or whatever, or a new F-35 tire. Anyway, so they had this recommendation for a National Advisory Council on Research and Innovation, NACRI, which I think there was some sort of inside joke there for what an awful acronym. But the idea, again, was to have this body sitting above the Tri-Council presidents, and you can imagine how well that's going down with the Tri-Council presidents and the head of CFI to help coordinate. And a chief science advisor would be part of that. So this is really about coordination. And again, it was saying that we don't coordinate well. What we've done, in fact, you can see this with the picket fencing around the various funding agencies. So an egregious example was a number of years ago, 7 or 8 years ago now, where SSHRC decided not to fund any social sciences which were health related. They've rescinded that to some degree more recently in part, but that meant that if you were a social scientist working in the health sector, to do anything to do with health research, you had to go to CIHR, and there was no money transferred, and not only that, there was a completely different culture. So that community was literally devastated by that move, and it was artificial. There have been other attempts to try to identify areas of interdisciplinarity, and modern science is interdisciplinary, is cross-sectional. And so there's a small amount of money put into by CIHR and NSERC into the CHRP program. And it's still going, but it's a small amount. And these are very much artificial constraints because science really, we've defined these barriers in a very artificial way. I'm not sure this is going to would make much difference. It's cheap to put in place. And I'll come back to this again later. One of the criticisms was that this report is very bureaucratic. It's aimed at bureaucrats in Ottawa. If you read a lot of the 35 recommendations, they clearly, that's the audience. But it was written as a report to government. So that's to be expected. And David points out that NACRI, for example, will replace STIC. And he doesn't think STIC, the panel didn't think that STIC is working particularly well. So they weren't creating new things, they were changing things and revising and improving the matter. They also had this 4-agency coordinating board. Quite why this doesn't exist is kind of nuts. It does actually exist, it's somewhat informal, to get the presidents together, but really to do it in a very formalized way, and this is sort of a no-brainer. So, coming back to the funding, so David, I want to make this clear. So he was standing on guard, as it were, for advertising this report and talking to the researchers in Toronto. And he actually gave 2 talks. One was towards at the very beginning of May, which I went to. Very, very different tone to the one at the end of May. And I'm going to talk about that difference. But what he was saying, that with these 35 recommendations, there's a focus here. And he's focused on if we don't reinvest funding into science in Canada, everything else is basically spinning wheels and dotting I's and crossing T's. So there's a good section, again, in the report, which details the impact on funding. This is the amount, and David Naylor, when he was president of the University of Toronto, talked about this a lot, about the amount of investigator-initiated or unfettered funding compared with top-down funding, or fettered funding, as he called it. And there's a huge shift, and there's been a huge shift in that, and it's not overnight. It's been going on for a number of years. And David is a health systems researcher. He was the first, I think, chair of ISIS, which is a program which helps, it's a collaboration in Toronto, which pulls together the Ontario health data and is used for statistical analysis. So he's not a basic discovery scientist, but he understands the importance of investigator-initiated ideas and having diversity of opinions and empowering people to come up with ideas rather than administrators saying this is what's important. Now, we need to be responsive. We need to say, Zika virus or Ebola or SARS, whatever else, lots of challenges coming up, AI. We need to be responsive. And so you've got to give government something. And it makes sense because otherwise we will just, we can be like kids, 9-year-old kids playing soccer, just running after the same ball. We're all doing CRISPR if you're in biomedical research. And so you do need to pull people apart and to be ensuring we are addressing questions which are important. The fact is, most of the questions we're addressing are important, and they turn out to be very important later on. And that's, again, the problem of fundamental science, is we're doing things which you don't necessarily know it's going to be important in 5-10 years, and it is. And again, this is the amount of investigator-led funding and the priority-driven. So priority-driven actually hasn't gone up too much, but it's flatlined, whereas investigator-initiated funding has been plummeting. And they make some specific recommendations there, like here, how to change this, how to go back. So this is the first of the sort of the direct funding recommendation slides I've got. So I don't think this was particularly egregious. What they're recommending is over a period of 4 years to increase the amount of funding at the tri-councils by 30%, which brings us back to the equivalent in spending of around 2007, 2008. Right? So this would put us back to where we were. And that was somewhat the peak. And it's been going down since then. But it's not a huge amount of money. And as he talked about, because it's over 4 years, with some other things rolled in, I'll talk about in a few minutes, it's 0.1% of the total federal spend as an increase, so 0.4% of the total after year 4. So, this didn't seem like it's, they weren't asking for the sky here. And the other important part of this is that it shouldn't be going into top-down research funding. And that's a bit, one of these discordant facts. It looks like government now is telling us they want to have more control over what, they want us to be more responsive, and they want to have more say in what gets funding. And that's the trap which the previous government fell into, where, for example, the increase in budget every year was put into specific areas. So in essence, everything was flatlined. There was no increase in funding. Any increase was actually put into things like antimicrobial stewardship, which is a really important issue, not saying it's not, or the SPORE program, for example. They also talked about personnel. How do we support people? Studentships, postdoctoral fellowships, career support, CRCs. And they made the point, and there's changes here. I made changes throughout this to bring it up to date in some respects. There are problems with all these programs. We have a lot of bespoke programs, the Banting and the Vaniers. They didn't recommend that these were changed too much, but I think they wanted a review. Is this the best value? Are these systems working very well? And I think that they're leaving the research community to give feedback. The CRCs, when they were established in 2000, and there were 2,000 of them, haven't increased in value over that time. So there's been a net loss in spending power of about 35%. Moreover, there's only about 1,650 active chairs. And so they were calling for, there were 300, I didn't realize this, 350 chairs were retired, which is one solution some people have suggested for our funding roles. There should be more retirement. But the CRCs were not filled. And so they called for actually reactivation of those CRCs. So this is, again, part of this issue which they were told, I think, from us, time and time again. We've got a lot of fragmentation. We've got different funding agencies. We have operating grants which are not connected to salary support, which is not connected to infrastructure. And that's part of the rationale for NACRI and the coordination bodies. Whether or not that's going to achieve the solutions is not really clear yet. Probably not. So facilities and operations, and I kept this slide in because it's very important, very, very important. So this is their recommendation was to improve what's called the Research Support Fund, or indirect costs. And the average indirect costs, so if you have tri-council funding, this is what the university gets on top of the funding you get directly. It's about 20%. In the US, the negotiated rates are between around 40% to 75%. The actual rates are a little bit lower than that, but it's still much higher than it is here. And this is what that money is spent on. And of course, it's not sexy. It's heating, lighting, in many cases, salaries, et cetera, et cetera. But it's very difficult to fundraise if you're an organization. Nobody wants to give money for this sort of thing, again, which is another rationale for why government should be doing it. The charities, health charities, for example, do not provide any indirects with grants. So this is being subsidized by the universities. Now the reason, what they recommended is that the minimum indirect rate be set at 40%. It could be higher. And what happens here, this is depending on the size of the federal spend to each university, this is the indirect cost, and it plummets. So they're saying set it at 40. Why is this important? There are probably not too many administrators in this room. This is really important to the administrators, it's important to the universities. And if we want the universities to get behind this report, this is the slide which does it. Right? It immediately injects about 300, well, not immediately, over 4 years, injects $380 million per year into running, supporting science. So we really, I'm sure most of us would say, oh, just give me more money, more grants. But if we want the universities to be on side, this is key. So this is the budget, the budget request as a whole, again, passed over 4 years, starting next year, and it's broken down, and they were very clear, each line item was explained. This is to do with support of major infrastructure projects, which again, I think was a pretty good idea. This is fellowships, studentships, and the chairs. And then this is the indirect cost. So it adds up over at year 4 to $1.3 billion. Currently, the spend in the relevant areas is $3.5 billion. So it's going from $3.5 billion, which is the tri-council funding, CFI funding, and various flow-throughs to the tri-councils of $3.5 billion. So this would go to $4.8 billion after year 4. Okay? And if you think about it just from the tri-council perspective, it's a 30% increase over 4 years, so 7% or so per year, which, again, gets us back to where we were in 2007. Oh, do you want to take a picture of that? Christian, it's in the book. It's in the... Yes, this is the... this is the slide. So, to conclude on the report, this is it was very eloquent. The report was very eloquent. David and members of the panel were very eloquent. It's actually a beautiful read in many respects. It's all great. Urgent action is needed, they say. They make a plea to government. Stronger oversight and governance, which I think was, I don't know, they weren't necessarily saying that there isn't strong accountability. It's really about the coordination and transformative investments. Put those two things together and they're kind of a little scary to government. They weren't phrased in the best way. But, so what are the problems? So they had 35 recommendations, about 30 recommendations too many. It was 240 pages long. It was a third of a document, but it was meant to be. It's a very substantial piece of work. And there hasn't been one for 40 years. Right, so it's important. But more importantly, since the commissioning of the report, and certainly since its publication, before its publication, the world has changed, and government priorities have changed. So even if government was very keen on what the report was going to say, its enthusiasm is not as high. So the difference then between what David talked about, that's almost where his slides ended, and he didn't have the little commentary on the end there. Of the first talk. But then the second talk, he added some more slides. And this sort of got into the nitty-gritty. Okay? Again, I've modified those slides, but the theme is from him. So, first of all, he wanted to address the immediate criticism he had, feedback he had, which he said was largely positive of the report. But it was incrementalist, right? That there is again, little bits here and there. That is because it was about pragmatics. You can't suddenly, you've got to give government a way, you've got to give them the path. And what this report does is provide a framework for the next 20 years, which is why, with the trainees in the audience, this is going to impact you, not now, but in many years to come. It has this bureaucracy meme. Again, that was because of who it was targeted to, but it needs translating. In fact, it needs translating to the MPs. It was targeted to the bureaucrats and not to the MPs, and that's problematic because we have to take our messages from this. Redistribution, and that's really a funding, how to put more money into, again, direct investigative initiative funding, and affordability. And again, this is putting things into perspective with the overall budgetary spend of the federal government. So, as he mentioned, the response was positive with specific emphasis and moderate caveats. So then he talked about what advice would he give us. And we sort of laid the landscape before he spoke. You can imagine getting 190 or so scientists in a room. It could be dangerous, especially as there were quite a few press there. And there were some reports. So Ivan Semeniuk from the Globe and Mail was there for the entire day, as were several others. And they wrote some commentaries. So this is sort of motherhood kind of thing, and it's obvious, but we don't do it very well. So one voice versus cacophony. Broad support. So the idea is we get behind this report, the hashtag support the report, whatever. Take it in its entirety. It's got a few warts. There's a few things you may not disagree, you may not agree with. Forget that. It's the simple message. Let's move on from the report. The report's done. All the data is there. In terms of redistribution, money, this is the funding, moving funding from other areas. For example, applied research. This is, he said, nobody wins a zero-sum game. We need to add money to the federal pot, the spend on science. That's the problem. The problem isn't necessarily that money is going elsewhere. You could argue, again, with a defense budget or whatever else, but who knows, right? You're much better to argue why you need money for science. And if we prioritize and take, cherry pick what we think is good, it can be a real problem, because what you end up then with is you get special interest groups which can become very powerful, have very good connections, and it's then the quality of your lobbying rather than the quality of what you're trying to do. So he gave them advice, used salient examples, and we kind of know this, and I'll come back to this in a second. Personalize, have narratives, build stories. That's what we actually are good at doing. Translate the messages, because the report does not, it doesn't baby feed us, it doesn't tell us exactly what to do, but we should know. Keep the message positive, with one exception, and highlight the potential. What can be achieved if only this report was implemented? And the exception is the risk to the next generation. And the point, Terry mentioned this at the beginning. So this government does seem to respond to younger Canadians. I think there's a zeitgeist there in terms of the situation for the younger generation, job security, everything else. And although they keep everything between the middle class, whatever it is, brackets, this is one area which I think there is some resonance. So trainees, young investigators are key to getting this message across, because it's a real risk to them. Why would they ever stay in science? And they've got alternatives. Now, Kirsty Duncan, she gave us a bit of a cold shower. She sent a letter to me to be read out, which Imogen read out at the beginning of the meeting. And this is just a little one section from it. So she's considering the recommendations, blah, blah, blah. But then she has this caveat. However, in my role as minister, I must balance the needs of the research community with the needs of Canadians. My goal is to improve support for scientists, but not at the cost of some of Canada's most vulnerable people and communities. This was, and when David was just getting ready to come up, and he saw that, and you could see his face, the blood drained. I'm exaggerating, but he specifically addressed this in the Q&A session afterwards. So there are a number of issues with this. One is that balancing the needs of the research community with the needs of Canadians suggests that she thinks that the research community has special needs or is different, and instead of understanding that what we're trying to do is improve the lot of Canadians. And this is essential to the prosperity of the country. So quite why a science minister would make that distinction, I think it's quite, and I'm not saying she wrote this, it's probably one of her support people wrote it, but and then to improve support for science, but not at the expense, essentially, of supporting our most vulnerable people and communities. So, this report underlines the need for diversity and equity in research, the importance of Indigenous research across the board. How are we going to improve the lives of marginalized people without evidence, without building or understanding? So this was kind of, what is it called? It's really a false dichotomy. And I think this is very important for us to challenge the minister. Now, she is very much on side for this report. She would love, you can imagine, as a sort of junior minister, to have this report implemented by government would be great for her, be a huge feather in her cap. But she is the person now managing expectations in a very, very serious way. And it's right. So, just the last couple of slides. So the biggest challenge for us in going forward, and I think the discussion panels will discuss this as well, the government is really showing very little enthusiasm for the tri-councils, and it's not clear why. And part of that, we saw over the last budget. Part of the last budget, I think, was because they didn't understand the tri-councils. They didn't understand how the funding, the mechanism by which funding is stabilized in Canada. And they could have translated, some of the vociferous concerns about CIHR, for example, over the past couple of years, the reforms, as being the research community doesn't like the tri-councils. That's not the case at all. And James Philpott certainly knows that's not the case. We've got distractions globally and south of the border in particular. In the budget 2007, when I spoke to one of Kirsty Duncan's leads, he said, well, you got money last year in the budget. Why are you complaining? And they're rewarding lobbying. So the funding, which there was money for science, there were some really good ideas and good things which got funded, but they were more niche, with the exception, I think, of MyTax. MyTax was less, not exactly niche. But there was some funding, but it wasn't through the tri-councils. There's this problem of government. They really seem to be conflating innovation and science somehow. So we have this $950 million, almost $1 billion being put into this innovation superclusters. And there's a lot of details missing from that. And the universities will have a role, right? So the universities are promoting this. And this is Navdeep Bains, the Minister of Industry, Science and Economic Development. This is his key initiative. But they maybe are thinking that they're putting money into this, and so it's the same. It's going to be science. It's not in any. These are industry-led initiatives. Retail politics. How do we get the public interested? The slim appetite for new funding because of the deficits. That's why I fell asleep last night. Alliances are essential, multi-led, I'll come back to that. We need to ramp up communications and advocacy over the summer. This is part of that. And we've got to be thinking as well, the likelihood is this government will get re-elected. It's just the way it is if you look historically. So we also got to be thinking in the long game. And the panel was thinking about that. That's why they were talking about funding over 4 years. But there's an imperative. And the imperative is if we don't do something now, we're in trouble. So, what to do? We need multiple harmonious messages. We've got to be on the same script, but it's not got to be a tight script, right? So we're not going to be reading out the same words. Invite MPs of all parties to labs, to meet with trainees, to talk, not to show shiny equipment, to tell them what you're doing, why you're doing it, and ask for meetings with them. Go to their barbecues. I know it's not the best barbecues, but this is going to be at all career levels, especially trainees. And we can see this, what happened in the UK election. It was the turnout of the young, the 18 to 24-year-olds, which made the difference in the UK. Letter writing is not enough, but, and Michael can talk more about this, there's a fantastic toolkit at this site, the Association of Canadian Early Career Health Researchers, and it's for everybody. It's not, you don't have to be an early career health researcher to make use of this toolkit. We've got to engage business leaders, this was mentioned before, university presidents, hospital CEOs, as well as researchers. We've got to keep, there's lots of advantages. Here in the US, as David mentioned, Harold Varmus got others to do his bidding for him. He got industry to do bidding. We don't do that here in the same way. We've got to get these people involved. And on the university boards, on the hospital boards, there are some very powerful people. We're going to paint a picture of what's going to happen if we carry on this path. And Lisa Galea and Holly Witzman put together just for health researchers, and this is documenting the outcomes of the CIHR cuts to funding and the cancelled competitions and the reforms. And it's hard hitting. There are lots. It's anecdotal. It is not representative, but there are direct impacts of the changes which were made 2 to 3 years ago now, and that's going to continue for a while. That's going to, and it'll continue, and it'll disenfranchise the next generation of researchers. Key people, these are the key people in the PMO and around cabinet, but there are lots more people. And what we've got to do is you have to educate them around the value. What do the tri-councils do? Most people don't know. Most MPs don't know. Most MPs haven't heard about the Naylor Report, remarkably. Stability of the funding reduces niche funding. It helps them. They're not going to get lobbied all the time. It allows for better coordination. And we need to be campaigning for all councils, not one. So if the health researchers, you're thinking about CIHR, but every dollar which goes to CIHR, there's another dollar which goes to NSERC, and $0.50 approximately goes to SHIRC. So that's how government treats it anyway. So we should be speaking with one voice, all researchers. So the conclusion of the Researchers' Summit on May 31st was we need to, it's all hands on deck. The next 3 months are critical. We're a coiled spring. You've got the investment actually made by the Liberal government, by Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien at the end of the 1990s, creating CFI, CRCs, the indirect program, Genome Canada. All those things were good, and we've built up this capacity, and there's a lot of really, really good research, a lot of pretty good infrastructure, but we don't have operating funds. And we've got lots of new and brilliant brains who have been, who are ready to go. So this is actually a way of you can turn it's going to be science has long outcomes. That's the problem. But we can make a difference. They will see a difference very quickly. And that's very important to politicians. That's the only thing which is probably important to politicians. So we put up on YouTube the discussion group summaries. We had 9 different discussion groups dealing with all aspects of the report. And those are on YouTube. And also we set up just an opt-in email account which goes to my computer when I log in, and it's just to disseminate information and activities going forward, to keep people up to date, and it's low traffic. I think there's been 2 emails got out from this, trying to keep it on. So if you want to know a little bit more, then please join that. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. I think we'll wait for questions for you when after you can just join the end of the first panel discussion. So right now we'll invite the first set of panelists up. Kristen, Michael, and Janine, please. So I think rather than pick one of you to go first, I'm just going to start from the furthest from me. So we'll go in order. Then Michael, Kristen, Janine, and then Christian. So 5 to 8 minutes, and then we'll save some time for discussion. So
I start. Okay. So Jim mentioned that I'm part of this early career investigator advocacy group. That's our usual axe to grind, but we've kind of decided to put that axe away while we talk about the Naylor Report to a large extent. So he mentioned that our group, led by Holly Whitteman, has put together this kit about how to talk to MPs about the Naylor Report, in particular, maybe MPs that have never heard of the Tri-Councils or don't really know why or if the federal government should be supporting university researchers. So this is kind of, we're starting way deep in our own zone, kind of. So it starts with very basics of advocating of how science helps Canadians, why university science is important, its effects on local economies, and all these kinds of things. So you can find that online, and I won't go through it in detail. I wanted to talk about what we think is one of the biggest sort of dangers or potential pitfalls of scientists advocating to government and being one set of stakeholders in how the government supports research in Canada. He touched on this as well, Jim did. It's really we have to speak with one voice and explain that the Naylor Report is not sort of a buffet to choose from the programs that are most appealing to a particular government minister or to a constituency, but that it's a set of really interdependent recommendations. It kind of all has to happen. So the question isn't, should we have this program and this program and this program? The question is, do we need to and should we reinvest in Canadian research? If the answer is yes, then the Naylor Report and really the whole report is how we do it. So half measures aren't really going to work. We've seen the sort of decline he showed in those graphs of the funding environment, and something has to be done. So I bring this up because of this fragmentation of interest, I think, has been the response to the declining funding environment. So as the situation has sort of deteriorated and the Tri-Councils have sort of flatlined or declined, there's been a lot of appeal into putting money into sort of niche boutique initiatives that look really good. So these are things like the CIRCs and the CFREFs and all these sort of acronyms with excellence in them somewhere. And it's not that these things don't fund good and important research, but I think of them sort of as they're kind of like, to me, they're like private schools. They are great for the kids who go there, but they're not really a part of a national education strategy. So I think these programs are great for the small percent of researchers who get to participate in them, but they don't really advance or build the capacity of Canadian science and research. So they're appealing because there are a lot of sort of PR bang for your buck. I don't think there are a lot of scientific bang for your buck, and there needs to be an evaluation of the whole ecosystem. And I think that comes across really strongly in the report. And this is what it really represents as a breakthrough in how hopefully the government thinks about scientific funding, although there isn't much sign of that yet. So I was skeptical when I first saw the panel. There was a quote by Paul Wells that sort of described how I felt better than I could have. There was considerable skepticism about Naylor's panel among younger scientists because it seemed custom designed to parrot the orthodoxies of Ottawa's research policymakers back to them. That is exactly what I thought when I saw the panel. But when I met with them, it was very clear that it was truly going to be a ground-up consultation, and they wanted to build the report around what active researchers were concerned about and how they felt that the mission of Canadian research could be fulfilled. But even then, I was surprised the extent to which the report in its final form exceeded my expectations in articulating these problems and what I think the right solutions are. So it's my sincere hope that the report becomes unifying, particularly its central recommendation of putting a lot more money into the Tri-Councils. And we're really going to need this unified message to do that. So I think the biggest risk is not being unified, and my biggest fear is that we don't necessarily have university leadership on our side with a lot of these things, because I think they've gotten into this mode of pursuing these niche mechanisms because they're what was available and where the growth was, and it seems like both the government and universities are still often in that mode at the expense of pushing for substantial core operating support through open programs through the Tri-Council. So I think the Naylor Report does that well, and I hope we can get everyone on board, and we're never in a position where different stakeholders are picking and choosing from among the report's recommendations. So that's all I have to say.
So Mike did a really great job of introducing the importance of advocating for the Naylor Report as a whole. So this is no longer pick and choose your own adventure. This has to be accepted because it's all interconnected. There's no point in increasing the amount of CRCs if we're not increasing the amount of research dollars. And so this is the Canadian Society for Molecular Biosciences. We've been around for far too many years, like 110 in various forms. But in the last 6-7 years, we really took it upon ourselves to start advocating as the money went down. And so I'm here going to describe to you a few of the things that the CSMB is doing in response to this report. And I think this will be echoed by many societies across Canada, I hope, who are now getting on board and realizing they need to get involved. And I think the number one thing that we're going to do with our members is get this message across, because I think you're all here because you are interested in it, but it's quite shocking how many of our fellow professors, our trainees, even, I hate to say, our administrators, don't really even know what this report's about and why it's so important. So one thing we are doing is we're creating information decks for people, so then when they go out and do the things we're going to ask them to do, hopefully they're at least going to be educated. So we are really emphasizing that the scientists need to be collaborative. So you have to know your audience. And this Liberal government, their mandate is, it's everywhere you read it, it's about collaboration, right? So we need to be seen as collaborative, and we as in the scientist community need to be seen as part of the fix. We are here to help build better Canadian science research infrastructure, whatever you want to call it. So we're trying to get to our members that this is up to them to be part of the solution. We need them to understand the report thoroughly so they can communicate it correctly, and we're going to provide them tools how to communicate it. So what do we want them to do? The first thing we're starting is, as we always do every year, is we want people to start thanking the government, their MPs, their PMO, for their CIHR and SHRC grants. And so we've rolled out the CIHR. So anybody who got a CIHR project grant will have, within a week, if they haven't already, will be getting emails from CSMB asking them to thank the government. And this is actually very well received, because normally when we send an email to our MP, it's not a thank you email, it's a like email. And these are actually counted, and I know from talking to the presidents, it does make an impact. And within that thank you is getting towards the message of the Naylor Report. Of course, we're going to do things like the letter writing campaign, like that Mike has described. We're also providing tools about how to invite your MPs. We're encouraging universities to start having MP days, so bring your MPs in. And I think more importantly, we're organizing specific tools for trainees. And we right now have trainee board members, and we're working with them to try to come up with something that trainees can actually do and engage in, because as we've heard many times, this is a government that loves youth. So it's important to get out there. As a CSMB executive, we are in the process of lining up and engaging with meetings. So those aren't just the ministers, which I think are important, but you need to hit the level below. So the assistant deputy minister level, I have access to people, for example, who could be on the Privy Council or on the Treasury Secretariat. And these are just because people I live in my community, you get to know them. So there's other ways to advocate, and that's sort of a soft, behind the scenes type of advocacy that I really think is valuable. I don't think we should ignore there are other parties in Canada. So this is an outstanding time to start the conversation. We have a new conservative leader. We don't really know what's going on with the NDP, but NDP has also been historically quite supportive of science. So you got to diversify, right? Like your own portfolio. So that's something we're going to do. I also think it's important, and we've talked about this, you have to know who you're talking to, and you have to gear your message towards them. And this is something I think scientists are not very good at. Like, we've all had to be tortured reading people's bad lay summaries. Like, we have to start educating ourselves in how to talk and engage with different types of people. It's really, really important that we start changing our message. So this is part of the skill set question we were talking about. I think it's time that we integrate science communication into our education system, and it's time to really ramp up with our own faculty how to do proper science communication. And then I just have one more point, and I'm personally, I don't know exactly how to do this yet, and I'm still thinking about it. It's really important that we have other people advocating for us. It can't be the scientists and even the trainees asking. It's probably going to be more powerful to have other very influential people in there advocating for us. So whether that's business or insider champions. So in Ottawa, I'm trying to hook up with many of the big high-tech players in town, and these people, especially the younger generation, like the Shopifys, they do have the ear of the Prime Minister. These are 45-year-olds running billion-dollar businesses. These are the people we need to champion this report. And I would also emphasize that soon we will learn about the Chief Science Advisor. This will also be one of our top advocates in Ottawa because they have been screened. They will have unfettered access to the PMO's office. So that's a really, really important person that we need to get behind whoever is appointed in that and really be positive and supportive. And similarly, I think we need, no matter who ends up as president of CHR, this is another opportunity as a community to really finally be positive. And the government sees that we are supportive, we are open to change. I think it will start changing the conversation because unfortunately, I think we hear so much is the negativity, oh, this happened, that happened with CHR, I didn't get enough NSERC money. You know, this is really not the way this government operates. So you have to acknowledge that this is a different collaborative environment, and we need to change our message to be that more positive. We are here to work with the government, and including there's so many things in that Naylor report that we can do as a community without the government doing it. And one easy one is the EDI issues, so equity and diversity. Like, there's no excuse. We can actually do that as a community. We do not need government policy changes on that. And I think that would actually go a long way to showing the government that we're on board and we are collaborative, we are positive, and we make an impact in Canada. That's my rebel-rousing speech of the day. All right.
Hi, my name is Janine, and I'm from the chemistry department. And I guess I agree that we need to have one voice, and we need to have unified, salient examples why the Naylor Report should be implemented. And we should focus on how we convey that message rather than explaining in detail what's in the Naylor Report. And for myself, I'm an educator, so I'm used to talking in front of a class, explaining some chemical concept. But I realize in going through this exercise that I actually need to learn how to communicate much better. And I found that organizing our message to tell the government, we've listened to your comments, and we are filling the needs of Canadians already. We have been for many years, thanks to the past investments that you've made. And so I see 4 things that we can do to try to help support the Naylor Report. First, we need to connect with the members of Parliament, and this has been circulated. And when Terry said, would you like to be on the panel? I said, well, I'm an experimentalist, so actually let's try it out. Right, so last week I figured out who my MPs were. I called them. Then I got their assistant. And their assistant wants to manage the time of their MPs. And so they want to know in about 30 seconds, like, why do you want to meet your MP? And then I said, it's about the Naylor Report. And then I had dead silence, right? And so, like, you need to have a 30-second elevator pitch why it is that your MP needs to meet you, either in person or on the phone. And the first answer that you get is like, well, the MP is very busy. And then you say, okay, that's no problem. I will send you a small brief, you know, just like highlighting why this is important. And then 15 minutes later, then you get somebody that says, all right, we have 20 minutes, the MP will call you or you can come, and this is how it's going to happen. So that's great, right? You have an appointment, but then you have no idea what is it that you want to get the MP to do for you, right? So then you call around. And then I came up with my plan. And my plan is that I want my MP to sign me up to a parliamentary commission in the fall. Ideally, I would like to have an allocution spot for the Standing Committee of Finance. And then you say, well, if I want my MP to sign me up or to use their writing time to promote the Naylor Report, then I need to figure out what my elevator pitch is going to be. And I understand that we are suffering, that the students are suffering, that we need more money for the basic research. But I think that this message will not work. The message that will work is linking basic research historically with innovation, because innovation is the key word, it's the momentum that the government wants to build. So we just need to tell them how we fit in equating basic research and innovation, and then we need to show them using past examples like AI, like superconductivity, like microelectronic chips that allow people to hear better, giving them these salient examples that we need, saying we fill the needs of Canadians. And then also, I think it's important that whatever we do needs to be positive. We don't want to whine and say that we're lacking something. We want to say that we're working really hard and we're trying to fill the needs of the Canadians, and with just a little bit more means, we would still be competitive. We would be able to provide jobs, and we would be able to attract that talent that we need in Canada, considering that we don't have a very high birth rate in Canada. So that's a good selling point, I think, as well. We can't do this without our administrators, our university administrators. So then I tried it out too. I wrote an email to Madame Fortier last Thursday telling her, why don't you take my spot on this panel? You'd be more suited than me, considering your vast experience. And I would like to know what your opinion is. Friday morning, she called me, and yesterday morning, I was in her office so she could talk to me about what it is exactly that we wanted to do for the Naylor Report. And she said that if we were trying to unify our voices and reach a brief and go to, the media, then she would dedicate somebody at VP Communications to help us do this. If we had a good letter, she would send it out to other university presidents. So I think that it's possible for us to engage our administrators by, positively working with them. And so then we have to engage our colleagues, which is really hard. So my suggestion is to use this brief and ask our department heads to reserve 10 minutes in our departmental assemblies. We're going to have at least 15 or 20 people in these assemblies that could write manuscript support letters that we could add together that would help our MPs advocate for us as well. The lobbying groups as well is a good idea. So personally, I've decided to try to approach the Partnership Group for Science and Engineering. They have breakfast clubs, which are supposed to be able to indirectly help us connect with people. And the final one is I'm trying to do something myself, which requires time. And it's requiring more time than I thought, but on the other hand, I do feel that it's a critical time. If we don't, each and every one of us tries something, then nothing is going to come out of it. Thank you.
That's great. Great discussion this morning. I think I think we have a large number of panelists this morning, and sometimes I kind of wondered, why we have so many. But I think actually it's a good idea because we all have different perspectives. And when I came here, I was wondering what could I say originally, because I think we all have different views, different ways to contribute. But a couple of times I heard the word administrator here, and I guess that comes to people like me who are part at some point linked a bit higher up in administration. Or that I wouldn't claim to have all the insights or all the challenges of our really upper administration at the university, but as Vice Dean Research, certainly I get to speak to our VPR on a regular basis. I see the rector, and these can certainly be useful here and play a link, have a link. Sometimes people ask me, "Oh, Christian, do you still have a lab?" That's the question I get most. Besides, "Oh, are you at McGill?" No, I'm not at McGill, and I still have a lab. Okay, and I actually do have a lab. I'm funded still by CHR and CERC, Genome Canada. I know the feeling. I know the feeling to get a grant rejected. I know what it is for a researcher. I know all the challenges. And in my spare time, I also work with the CSMB with Kristen. So for quite some time, I was past president and president of the society. And those of you at McGill who have actually received a project grant, congratulations, you received an email from me last week, so to actually asking, to thank the government, which is very good. Maybe just from the point of view of administration, in a way, sometimes professors who are not very much exposed to administration sometimes have views on that they do nothing, or not enough, which may or may not be true, but there's different pressures also administration have to respond to. And certainly one pressure is that, they have to live with the programs, they have to go for grants which exist. Like, I have my views on CFREFs. I have my work, my views on CERC, which I will not, I think will not share here in the open, but you can divine them. But, I still, can administration turn away money which is on the table, even if we question whether this is a good use of resources? Yesterday, I received an email telling us, the new program for these Canada 150 chairs, which is a huge amount of money, which we have to find a candidate for, X-rays this summer to recruit by the end of the year. And there's a lot of money on the table here, which, well, could be given otherwise. Anyway, so what can we do? Certainly we do not whine. I think the message is very clear from the Naylor Report. I don't want to repeat what others have said very clearly. But certainly what has happened at the administration level, at the level of vice deans, at the level of CHR University delegate, which I'm as well, there's a growing consensus that, we have to act countrywide and we have to mobilize our communities. Certain devices of research, I'm in the faculty of medicine, so I cannot, wouldn't be credible to talk for social science and NSERC, but, it's extremely important. Certain devices of research are very actively discussing what to do, how to make follow-up from the recommendation of the Naylor report, how to work with our upper administration, but also how to mobilize our community and that countrywide. When I say countrywide, I'm not only talking about institutions like McGill and UDM. We're always quite focused on the U15. And the U15, of course, is very important, the big research universities. But when you look at the science ecosystem in Canada, I think the number of scientists supported by SSHRC and by NSERC are much larger than, this includes the smaller institutions, small and mid-sized institutions who, to a large extent, have been even more affected by the funding shortfalls over the last 10 years. I know colleagues from a smaller institution in Southern Ontario who told me, we have 5 to 10 colleagues, they are now tenured professors, full professors. Now they got a 26K NSERC discovery grant, which is like where they are at 55 years old. So, which is, has consequences we can all see. But, the loss, what we're losing out by actually funding science at this level, I think is very clear. That's why that's also why we have to act in these societies. When you talk to MPs and politicians, certainly there's one thing that I would say some more about, but I think we should and could be doing here in Montreal to our local MPs. But when we look at this in the countrywide setting, when we see there's 330 or so, 334 MPs, many of them are conservatives, who may form the next government. I don't want to scare anybody, but they may form the next government. We never know. And, we should also reach out to these people. We should make sure that people, in Whitehorse, people in Lethbridge, Alberta, that, that there's things going on and that people are being communicating to their MPs who may or may not be decision makers in the past. And certainly the Naylor Report, and I think that's really one of the many strong features of this report, doesn't pick winners. It says, ask broadly for support of research, including funding for universities for the overhead, but also doesn't say, oh no, we need money for CHR research, we need money, it's not picking winners. This is more important than others. I think that's extremely important and can also be communicated on a countrywide level. Now for us here in Montreal, and I'm not repeating what anybody else, but I think sometimes I wonder, for a city like Montreal, just country Montreal, yeah, sometimes it feels like it. But I think for us, sometimes I wonder is whether we as scientists do really value enough the huge economic impact of science. Because in the end, we can all say all the nice things about how important it is for society and the creation of knowledge, and I'm buying all these arguments. But sometimes MPs who want to be elected, they worry more about jobs. And this is, I think, came also up when we saw this statement from Kirsty Duncan here, which kind of seems to indicate that, money which goes into science somehow is being given to scientists to do science and to create knowledge. Yes, that's it, but what else does it do? If you get a CHR grant, 200K, a decent CHR grant, this pays many people. This creates a lot of jobs. And I know it's not for necessarily the long-term job creation sometimes politicians think about, but still you can make the numbers and run the numbers. And when I see a city like Montreal, Montreal is the biggest university city in Canada. We have more students, more research activity than Toronto, even if U of T is always number one. I think for us, the economic impact of the implementation of the Naylor Report would be huge, also not only because, but also because of the job creation. And I think this is something we should value more, not as the only argument, but I think this should be part of our portfolio of arguments, which also came out, when, I can also offer my unconditional support to the Young Scientists Initiative, the Early Career Researcher Initiative, which is great. And at the meeting in Toronto, there was one colleague who kind of said he tested some ideas with his local MP. I think it was in Waterloo or London, and he said his MP, he was like, oh, jobs. I pay my research associate, a postdoc, and 5 students, right? These are jobs, and I hate to say it, these are middle-class jobs. And this is something, this is a language maybe you're not used to exploit, but these are all middle-class jobs which are being supported. And if my research associate, if I let this person go, that's a middle-class job which is off. If I get a second CHR grant, I have 2 more RAs, right? Middle-class jobs. So we shouldn't shy away from using this argument here. What could we do here in Montreal? There was one initiative which I think would be maybe a suggestion here for my colleagues as department chairs, which in Toronto at U of T, apparently all the basic science chairs got together and wrote a letter to their MPs. And they wrote a letter not only to one MP, they wrote a letter to all the MPs in the Greater Toronto area. All the basic sciences chairs signed this letter, and it was a one-pager. It was a one-pager, not long, saying what we all know, but written to all the MPs in the Greater Toronto area, doing what we all have discussed, inviting them to see the labs and to talk to them. And I think that's something we could pull off in Montreal without any problems. Why not the basic science chairs from McGill and UDM together? And of course, science chairs should be invited. Just write a letter, why not to all the MPs, a one-pager, hey, here's a Naylor Report, it's really important. It's important for the economy of our city, for the economy, job creation. And all the other things are nice as well. Anyway, that's a suggestion, and if anything, I would be happy to help on the UDM side to coordinate such a letter if our colleagues at McGill would think about this. I would like to finish now. It's like sometimes a question, I was at a meeting organized by Rémi Quillon recently, more like an international economic forum that talked a lot about SARS, Ebola, AIDS, and sometimes I kind of wonder, the question to which I don't have an answer, what is the cost? They always talk about cost of investments. It costs money to do research, but what is the cost of doing nothing? What's the cost of not investing in research? And then, an example which comes to we all have seen the consequences of SARS, Ebola. What would have been SARS virus is probably was some obscure virus which was not really considered medically important, right? Not many people worked on this. And when the outbreak came, people were kind of scrambling who actually knows about this strange virus. It was never on the priority list, right? Ebola was neglected for different reasons, but there's a cost to doing nothing. Last example I have, this morning I saw in the Globe and Mail, Andre Picard wrote an article on antimicrobial resistance. And Jane Philpott, this was tweeted, I tweeted, Jane Philpott has retweeted this. Oh yeah, it's important to create, to fight antimicrobial resistance. But the very last thing we need now is to have a special pocket of money for antimicrobial resistance. I'm a bacteriologist and it's wonderful. But if anybody asks me, we need money for science. And some of the money will go to bacteriology to create new knowledge to also fight antibiotic resistance. But certainly the last thing we need now is to create a special program now to fight antimicrobial resistant bacteria. Of course it's important, but I think for us, the consensus is important. I think we all we understood. If we do not stand together to ask for support for research together, we're all going to lose out. And this is the message I think we should communicate. Also those people who just may ask us, should we do something for AMR, antimicrobial resistance? No. Better support science at NSERC, at CHR, and at SHIRC. I think that would be my answer. Anyway, thank you, and good discussion.
So we'll have some time for some questions before the break, and I don't know if you want to come back up, Jim, and stand there and let them pepper you as well. But David and I will circulate with microphones.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. I appreciated very much your comments, and which related, in my mind, mostly to community mobilization. I'm very much involved in Quebec higher education processes and the professors' associations. And I'm wondering about the role of the provinces. I would think that given, for example, Christian's statement about the wealth, the economic advantages of having a strong university has been seen in Montreal, and whether much more emphasis should be placed on the role of the provinces in lobbying to the federal government, because they have every interest in maintaining high-level universities. As also mentioned, that many smaller universities are suffering, and therefore professors are not functional, really, because of lack of research. So that's my wondering what you thought of the involvement of provinces.
For me, certainly, I cannot speak for the Quebec government, but certainly one thing, we all have our views on the current Quebec government, but, the fact is they have balanced the budget for 3 years now. And now they're reinvesting. They also want to get reelected next year. And they decided that to do exactly what we hope the Canadian government will do with the Naylor Report. All the investment in the FRQ, which are like the funding system here in Quebec, phased in over 3 or 4 years. This is exactly what we kind of expect, broad support for science, as, all these documents. The Quebec government has it. I cannot speak for the government. Certainly, this is a channel we could use. But certainly, one thing we can certainly say, listen, the Quebec government has actually done the right thing already. And that also do we get reelected. They understand the value for the economy. They also gave money for artificial intelligence, nothing wrong with that, but they also invest into basic science. So for me, it would be more a pitch like, listen guys, the Quebec government, they balance the budget, very, very much unlike Canada and Ontario, and they still give more money for science because it's the right thing to do. Why don't you do what Quebec does at the Canadian level? It would be one thing, one line you could use when you have when you talk to your politicians.
So I guess in my efforts last week as well, I reached out to Madame la Ministre David, and she was. They said that if we provided a brief and sent in a formal letter, they would definitely look at it. So I think that we have a lot of opening, and it was the same thing for my provincial MP that said that there was opening. So I think it's a question of us actually reaching out and doing something.
It's a really good point. And just to reiterate, we've heard. So you think about who's going to benefit from the implementation of the Naylor Report. And the provinces are clear winners because they're not being actually asked to put money in, and they get benefits because it's local benefits, especially to centres, the major centres with the universities. And I don't think we do engage our provincial politicians as effectively. We don't necessarily engage our federal politicians that effectively either, but they do have when they get positive messages, when they can say nice things to government, they like to do that because they don't want to be, then they'll ask, the next question will be, the health transfers or whatever. So I think it's a very good point, and it sort of underlines the issue here that we should be reaching out to a lot of different communities who, and influencers who we normally perhaps wouldn't think of. So it's a good question.
Good morning. Thank you all very much. My name is Lisa Munter. I'm from the Department of Pharmacology and Therapeutics, with emphasis on therapeutics, I guess. I'm wondering, so I totally agree that we have to reach out to the community and communicate our science, but one area where the community or the public is already very active, at least in comparison to Germany, is that there are so many foundations. People donate. They donate so much to fund research for cancer, glaucoma, Alzheimer's. So I'm actually wondering if there are any data how much research funding is actually done through foundations. Can we compare that to the tri-agency funding? I mean, it will be a proportion of it, but would those people be able to speak for us? I mean, they get the public money, the support is there, and they need governmental funding to, that they often initiate research programs in a lab, and then they need governmental big funding to get it running.
So I'll address some of these issues. So there are quite a few of the foundations that actually have come out with very formal, strong statements for the Naylor Report. So for example, the Canadian Cancer Society, CCSRI, the Research Institute part of it, they have done it. So they see their position within the cancer research field as an integrated one with CIHR. So some of the foundations are actually, and I think the Heart and Stroke Foundation too, if I remember correctly, they have come out with strong statements for the report, right? Because this is, they're not doing it on their own, right? They need the CIHR to push through a lot of these things. So they are definitely on board. I mean, maybe a strategy would be to have them more actively with the MPs. So that could be something, I know some of them personally, to talk to them and see if they'll get on out there and do something. Yeah.
The health charities too find it very difficult to raise funding, more difficult to raise funding for areas of basic science, and you can kind of see that they've been shifting to more translational research. But I don't think they really think that that's because there's not more to be discovered. It's just that it's easier to raise funds for things which are more tangible, they can explain. But I think as well, the question was also how much funding goes into the ecosystem from the charities. It's actually quite small compared with the tri-councils. When you're looking at CIHR, for example, or NSERC, it's about $1 billion a year. You add up all the charities, all the health charities, and I'm not sure about the outside of the health sector, it's around about 100 million, 125 million. And that's actually in the report as well. They did do that survey. And I think there's a lot of public support for those areas, but it's not a substitute. So coming back to what Kirsty was saying, it actually it's very important to get them, the health charities, on side and to continuously ask. Now, of course, they've got different agendas. They've got additional agendas as well. So we have to always remember that. But they've really got nothing to lose from this. And it's exactly the same question. What is the role of the federal government in Canada? And one of its roles is to be supporting the scientific infrastructure going forward, because you cannot expect the private sector to do that.
Mm-hmm. And I'd also point out that a lot of the foundations are actually, are formally associated with various lobbying groups, and probably the largest one is something called Research Canada. And they're a very good organization. Research Canada is taking a pretty high road on the Naylor Report, and they are going to actually, I think this Friday is going to be a very strong push to get this implemented. So a lot of the foundations are actually, they do have their lobbyists, and most of these organizations like Research Canada are coming out with their own strategies that are just purely pushing the Naylor Report through the government. So.
Hi, Kathleen from Evidence for Democracy. Thank you so much for a really insightful panel. I have a few points that I just wanted to build on a couple of the earlier questions. On the provincial track, if you, like me, live in Ontario, a reminder that we will be getting a chief science officer hopefully shortly, and that could be an additional route. We, like Evidence for Democracy, will be offering training to our supporters and members. Like you said, talking to your MP, there's sort of the nitty-gritty that's involved. And, you know, how do you get a meeting? So we will be offering some online training where people can come and ask questions, and we can talk through how to actually do this. And we're also going to offer training on how to write a pre-budget consultation. The deadline for that is August 4th. And speaking of, you know, some things that were mentioned earlier about speaking the language, if you look at the Finance Committee website, what they want to hear is, what do you want to see in Budget 2018 that relates to productivity and competitiveness? And so I think if we can take the report and fit it into that kind of a framework, there's a lot of potential there, and it also opens you up to being able to testify at committee if you submit. So I guess my question then is, you know, thinking about some of the tactics you mentioned here today, what other kind of hands-on training could we offer, especially for young researchers, in addition to sort of the toolkits that are available that might be helpful?
So one thing we've been suggesting with respect to the toolkit is that people maybe don't go it alone, like put together groups of different career stages, different fields, maybe different tri-council homes. And I think then you kind of naturally get a mix of people who have experience talking to politicians or at least different kind of issues. But I think we haven't pursued any kind of formal training for people, so these kinds of resources sound really good.
So I'm actually advocating at my university and other places that as part of graduate training that we actually incorporate these as mandatory courses, science communication. And that's everything from, you know, how to write your paper correctly to learning how to do proper media relations, you know, doing a 3-hour workshop on the elevator pitch. So these are actually skills that you need to learn. You don't learn it by osmosis. They're very well taught. These are important things, and they're also transferable skills. So even if a graduate student decides not to pursue a wonderful life in academia, these are skills that they're going to take with them forever. And I also think it's important to learn to tell a story. So instead of going to the meeting in Toronto, I was actually at a Beakerhead retreat. So this is run by Jay Ingram and his wife, Marianne Moser, and this is about science communication. And it was a writing workshop for 5 days, and I came out of that really realizing that I didn't realize how bad we really were, the scientists, right? And we have to think about, how do we communicate science, right? We have this point we want to get across. But you have to really think about your audience. And I think one thing that would be really valuable skill for people to learn is to think about different ways you're going to communicate. And one thing is science to the public, we need to make it entertaining. And I think that aspect is completely lost. We need to bring in the personal to every one of our stories, which I think for me is really challenging because I don't want to talk about myself. I'd rather talk about my science. But we need to bring that personal aspect to it. And I think it would be very important to start also engaging with educators. So we need to learn how to translate our science down to a high school level, to a junior high level, all the way down to kindergarten. And I think when you be able to have those skills, it really changes how you communicate, because you know who you're talking to and how you can change your story to match that individual's background and needs. Does this person need to be entertained? Does this person need to be educated? Is this person here, am I advocating with my MP? And at that point, you have to change your story completely. So I think these are skills that should actually be mandatory parts of curriculums.
Bruce Allen, Montreal Heart Institute. I just wanted to address a comment made just a couple of minutes ago about trying to get charitable foundations more involved in advocacy to the government. You need to be careful what you wish for in this, in doing this, because we're having a bit of an issue now with the Heart and Stroke Foundation, because they're wanting to actually divert more of their resources towards advocacy and away from supporting some of their research programs. And this has led to several quite animated conversations during the scientific review meetings in December in Ottawa, because we're seeing a drop in funding rates because the administration is starting to want to direct their time and their resources towards getting the government to spend more money on research or spend more money on heart-directed research, rather than them actually maintain the same level of funding they have historically for funding the same type of research. So one needs to be careful.
On that point, I mean, I think a lot of us are involved in some of the health charities, and you can see, like, I think it's the Cancer Research Society based in Montreal, had a 2 to 3-fold increase in the number of applications, largely because of the chaos at CIHR. And so they've had a lot of application pressure. Because of the recession, their remissions were going down, the amount of money they were able to raise was going down. And as you say, they also have been putting more emphasis on advocacy and actually direct-to-patient services, things like transportation and what have you. So those are all good things. But that's why, when I was talking about 125 million or so, that's not what charities raise. That's the amount they spend on research, and it's not a lot. So I don't think necessarily, I think it is, they are useful. They are, as Krista mentioned, they are well connected. They're very good at pulling both heartstrings, but also making pretty good cases for why we need to be doing something about Alzheimer's disease and diabetes and heart and stroke, et cetera, et cetera. They've got those arguments off pat, and they interact with the public all the time. So I think we can use them, but you're right, we've got to be careful. And it really, I think I'm not so worried in terms of what they're necessarily saying, because I don't think they're putting a lot into research. Having said that, we don't want them to be putting less into research. They should be saying, a strong government research effort helps us in many ways, including providing more knowledge for us to be able to use.
Hi, I'm Jason Tanney. I'm from the Department of Pharmacology. Thank you all for your insights. I just wanted to follow up on a point that I guess a couple of people have made about maybe placing greater emphasis on the economic benefits of implementing the Naylor Report. And I think it was clear to me, at least from Minister Duncan's response, that she seemed to be hedging and perhaps thinking about whether or not implementing this report would really be a political win. And I think that's something that we really have to try to convince MPs. So I met with my MP, also tried to discuss the Naylor Report and sort of the benefits of sort of increase in knowledge, and he came out with, I mean, his response was very, also sort of very cautious, and suggested that they're not clear whether or not implementing this report would be a political win. And I think in terms of a political win, we have to emphasize not something that's going to be a political win in 20 years, but something that would be a political win for whatever party implements this in the short term. And that's where I think emphasizing some of the short-term economic benefits of increased science funding could be crucial, perhaps maybe the most important point we should be making. So I was wondering if has anyone compiled sort of hard data on the benefits of increased funding for science, better economy, more jobs, things like that might be things that we could sell as benefits that would accrue in the short term rather than in the long term.
So our kit has a couple things in it. It's mostly based on analyses done in the U.S. with respect to NIH funding that calculates sort of the multipliers and return on investment of basic research funded through the NIH being translated into industry, basically. It's hard because the timescale of that is more like 10 to 15 years than like 3 or 4 years. And that's why I think this sort of closer in focus on the way research grants are spent on jobs, procurement of reagents and resources from locally based companies that also have employees and things like that. But I don't think we should shy away from that long-term thinking as well, and the fact that research is how we identify and solve problems in society, so it's not a cost, it's an investment in solving the problems that are political wins for them.
I just want to comment that I think that it's also possible to reach out to our IP and translational departments as well, right? In terms of performing a market analysis on some of like the salient examples that we're going to be putting in a brief. And so we do this all the time when we try to apply for an I2I grant, and so I think there's also resources within the universities that could help us provide these kinds of short-term economic benefits in terms of sizing the markets that are potential for different fields.
One last caveat on that is that I think part of the situation we're in now is because promises were made. I think they went back to the year 2000 or so, that if you do this, this, and this, then you will get this, this, and this back to government. And they're more cautious and more suspicious now. So we've got to be very careful to not exaggerate. But you can do that because even there's nothing more short-term than having a child, for example, in the hospital and not knowing what the outcome is going to be. It's about translating the work that's being done into narratives, even though you can never point to a specific piece of research leading to a cure or a better way of treating somebody, or a new product which is creating lots of different jobs. That actually doesn't really matter because no MP and nobody's going to say we want to go backwards in terms of the quality of care and the job situation. So you can actually challenge MPs quite easily, and you'll get them to agree with you when you say, do you understand the role that research and science has played in society in making Canada a great country in which to live? You won't get much pushback on that. Then you have to ask them, so why are we pulling back? Do you understand what will happen if we don't do something, if we don't come back to the levels that we were firing on all cylinders and fully realizing the potential of the country? And the other aspect of it is in terms of, it is about priorities, but the government, the government and politicians, and somebody was saying this, you were saying when they don't like bad news, they also want to manage expectations and to hedge bets, and they don't want to ever spend money because they know they're going to have to spend money at some point, and so they try to keep their powder dry. But it's pretty straightforward to say to them, we're on a precipice in terms of the next generation of researchers will make decisions, are making decisions now, and are seeing the stress that's gone on, and they're looking for messages. And I think the Naylor Report provides all those messages. It's very optimistic. So it's trying to keep this message positive, but getting them to understand the consequences of not doing anything. It's easy not to do anything, but we know what that outcome is going to be, because we've been living it for the past 5 years now or so.
So I just want to emphasize that I do, and I know from very senior government people that it is the job creation part really is a critical key here. And I think, we, as in CSMB a couple of years ago, or just last year, did do a push on that. And I was quite surprised at how many emails I got back from the science community dismayed that I was using, job creation instead of this, you should only be talking about innovation in science. And this is getting to this idea of you need to know who you're talking to. And it's more important for jobs in the economy. It's an easier sell than it is to go in there talking about, well, I'm going to discover where my protein X goes or whatever, right? And so I think on some level, scientists need to get off the high horse and really acknowledge that at the end of the day, this is a GDP. This is what it is. And to really, there's no harm in going this route and breaking down a grant and saying, where does that money go? And use the words like middle class. You read what comes out from the Liberal government, and there are certain words that will come out over and over again. You change your language to meet with the person, whoever you're meeting with, right? And if you go meet MP Scheer, you'll have to change your language again if you're going to go talk to the Conservatives.
Just one comment. We're going to have two more comments, and then we're going to have a break, okay? So Dan, and then back here.
Is this on? Yeah, I know I'm between you and your coffee, so I want to thank you all. This has really been quite instructive. But so I'm Dan Bernard, also from the pharmacology department here at McGill. I guess Terry put a lot of us in the audience. I'd like some advice on practicalities of how to get involved. So I actually work with several professional societies. I also sit on the Science Policy Committee for FASEB, which is the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology. So that federation actually represents 27 member societies, and I think something like 140,000 scientists. So they actually do get a seat at the table when they're doing their advocacy work. One of the things they organized every year is a Capitol Hill Day, where they mobilize scientists to go and meet with members of Congress or their staff. And they do this in a highly organized fashion, and when they prep people when they're going to meet with their members of Congress. They get to know something about those members of Congress beforehand, maybe a personal story where they see a way in to talk to them about how science has affected them directly. It's not as clear to me how we do that here in Canada. I mean, in fact, I'm asked all the time to go to Capitol Hill in the US, but I don't have a member of Congress anymore. I don't live there anymore. So I would like to do the same here. I don't know if this is what the CSMB is doing, but I can tell you that this is the first I'm hearing of the CSMB, and maybe that's in and of itself a problem. Maybe we can do something more on a national scale to make people aware of what organizations are out there, how we can work together to speak in one voice. I think that's a great message, but it's not clear to me how we actually do it. I mean, we can all go individually, but I think it'll be more impactful if we go en masse to Parliament and meet with our members of Parliament.
Yeah.
Just a second. Sorry to interrupt. Axel Vandenberg from MAUT. There is such an organization. It's called the CAUT. And every November, they organize Parliament Hill Days, and they encourage you to participate. So I can get you in touch with them if you're interested, and that goes for everybody else as well. They need people to talk to their parliamentary representatives, and they do pretty much the same thing. They give you a kit, they prepare you. You also have to stand outside in the demonstration for science in the cold in November. But that just firms up your commitment.
Can I ask you about this in terms of CAUT? So I don't understand why the U15, Universities Canada, CAUT, Research Canada, you name it, Healthcare Can, why they are not making the Naylor Report their number one and only priority for the next 3 months. That's all we're asking.
Well, at the CAUT meeting this year, we had David Naylor speak.
Yeah. So the CAUT is active in doing this.
But is that because when one looks at, and we sort of deride the issue, the comments about CFRF and CERC and what have you, and I do the same. And actually David Naylor wanted to make it very clear that how CFRF turned out was not what the universities had hoped, even though they'd lobbied for it. But they've been very effective when they've chosen a single topic and spoken with a single voice and gotten government to listen. And it's essentially because government ticks off, right? That's that part of the community, or that's part of the sector dealt with. If we can get all of our scientific associations and representatives to be speaking with that one voice, we've got a much, much better chance of getting it. And then they can move on to the next thing. You know?
Right.
But that's what I think we need. If we don't get that, then we do, everything we do personally and going to see our MPs is going to come to naught. We need those organizations to have nothing else on their mind, even though there are lots of other priorities. They've got to realize now is the time.
So, but where do you organize that from?
Well, that's probably
That's the hard part.
That's the biggest issue. So we don't have in Canada an FASIB, right? So, and we did about 10 or 15 years ago. And Christian, do you remember the name of the Canadian Society of Biological Sciences, right? So that only really handled like the biologists and, and the geneticists and the biochemists. And that went down in very nasty flames, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And I think it is time to start trying to organize that. Is it really, can you do it in a month, 2 months? No, it's not possible. And it's quite surprising that most of the societies, the science societies, aren't doing anything. Like, that's the harsh reality here. Right now you've got CSMB, that's been doing stuff for the last 3-4 years, and we've very effective. We now get called by the minister to talk to them. We don't, we're in a different little league right now. And you've got CAN, so the neurosciences, they're on board too. But it's pretty amazing. You call up the other presidents of a lot of societies, and they're like, oh, I don't, it's just not what they want to do. And I don't understand. Why not? What's the point of your society if you have no money and you can't do research? You're going to have another pissy little Canadian micro meeting, or like my own little protein dynamics meeting over here, or this meeting. And really, is that the purpose of your society? Is just a way to network? And if that's what you want, power to you. But I think that's a total waste of energy and money. And when we have this critical stage in Canada, I think, to really make it different. And I really hope that probably everybody here is a member of some society. You should be members of CSMB because we're the best. But you are members of your individual societies, and these things need to be brought up to the executive and outright say, what are you doing for the Naylor Report?
Sorry, we have one last comment before the break. I know I said that 15 minutes ago, but, I'm going to do it for real this time.
Hi, I'm Graydon Snyder. I'm from the Institute of Health and Social Policy, and I was working as a postdoc there. And I had a question about the message that we're sending to MPs about an increase in budget. Would it lead to a direct increase in jobs? Because, of course, the research itself will lead to potentially jobs in the future, but in the immediate present, we would have more employment at campuses and able to hire. My concern, though, is that what that message is could be interpreted as, given that a lot of research positions, PhDs, masters, and postdocs are temporary positions. You do not accrue any pensionable years or anything of the sort during those years of training. They're often trained very specialized. So basically, what I'm interested in is how do we communicate to an MP that this large increase in budget doesn't simply double the number of these temporary style workers, which then leads to an increase in a number of overqualified people then flooding the marketplace. How do we communicate that that is not what's going to happen? Because I'm actually worried that it is potentially going to happen. And so some of it's been alluded to, but I'd just like to hear maybe again thoughts about that.
So I think filling economic needs is important, but my personal opinion is that we should keep our rhetoric to filling all the needs, and I do believe that, you know, through innovation, more variety of jobs are going to be available. So from my personal perspective, I think we should keep our rhetoric to filling the needs of Canadian, including economic needs, but other panelists may have a different opinion.
Yeah, my pitch here would be, first, government is all very strong in training. We train the next generation of innovators, and right now, the clearest example here for Montreal is artificial intelligence. There's no way we can train all these people who will work there. But, we need this workforce to be trained. This comes from research. That's the one thing. And the other thing is it depends, of course, when you look at different labs, they have different composition. You have a certain number of students, you have research associates, postdocs. Some are more like temporary jobs, some are more long-term jobs. But, all in universities, what we're all struggling with right now is there's not enough money, for example, for overhead. Overhead funding can be used, for example, to give people long-term employment, actually to run facilities, to manage certain things, to be at the universities, maybe not professors. One thing we are really missing at many Canadian universities in general is you have professor or a student, right? But there's mid-level jobs. We need, certainly like bioinformaticians is an area I know quite well. We would need to find a way to have money actually to pay people who are maybe not profs, but who are qualified who don't want to be independent PIs, but who will be there on long term. And this is money these are jobs which could be funded either from better funded research grants, but also from increased overhead, so that the university could actually provide a more long-term perspective to these people. So I don't think we're overtraining. We certainly want to shy away from this, but if nobody trains the next generation of innovators, a key word which is who else would do it? But then again, we would also, with better funding in the system, we would be able to sustain more middle-class jobs on a longer-term perspective. I think you can credibly make this argument.
You're learning the language.
So I'll just tell you that let's take 5 minutes, get a coffee, get a snack, and then we'll come back. But because we're a little bit behind schedule, which is not a bad thing, but I'm just saying. Let's thank the first panel. And we'll try and reconvene in 5 minutes, or as soon as you can get back. So we've got a lot of good ideas so far, and a sense that we're all in the same boat, right? There's no more NSERC, no more SHIRK, no more CIHR. It's research. I think that's the message I hear. The other clear message I heard this morning so far was that if we want the universities to support us, we have to support the idea that indirect costs are a critical feature that the Naylor Report has to implement. So, all right. So we're going to just go again from my left to my right, and we'll start with Renee.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to take this in a little bit different tact from some of the other people. I have 2 basic points, and some of it will sound like I'm a glass half empty kind of person, which I actually am, and this will be some glass half full kind of stuff. So point number 1, stop treating us like R&D departments for industry. This comes from a person who's very successful in partnerships. I'm the PI of a SHIRK partnership grant that I've leveraged 1.3 times. I've had my tax. I've won a sub-grant from NCE, which, like many of the NCEs, was unsuccessful in commercializing itself. So I want to both promote the idea of partnerships and our seeking partnerships with civil society, with local governments, with regional governments, and with national governments. I don't think that that's separate from doing basic research. And I think what we can do is watch our words. It's very hard to argue against words like partnership, innovation, knowledge translation. These are very loaded words, very magic concepts. So we can't easily be against these. We can employ our own magic words like sovereignty and national security, it being a great country, we being sui generis, we being involved in discovery, and we being involved in gulp job creation. But what we can be against is commercialization, and I think that's one of the things that we have to challenge both to elected officials and to the Tri-Council, like Shirk, which has drunk the Kool-Aid regarding commercialization and its less insidious sounding word, innovation. One of the things that we can, and as part of that, we can be against serving as outsourced R&D facilities for industry. I think one of the things we can do is we can explain to elected officials and others what R&D looks like in this country, because I think that they really believe that R&D here looks a lot like R&D in the United States. And there is very little private sector R&D done in this country. There are a lot of regional outlets for multinationals that are housed in the United States. So a lot of the industries that we may wish to partner with are actually revenue centers. They're not cost centers, and cost centers is where R&D usually takes place. So one of the things that happens under that circumstance, on that scenario, is that we have these boutique programs like MyTax, in which we essentially function as outsourced R&D facilities for these companies, in which we do our students do very narrow answer very narrow research questions that are not generalizable to their larger research. So I think that we can do quite a lot to explain what R&D actually looks like in this country. It's very difficult to do things like leverage the endogenous Canadian companies, which are very small in comparison to a lot of the multinational firms. So second of all is, my second point is, it shouldn't be researchers' jobs to promote basic research to government. It should also be administrators' jobs to do so. And I don't think we should give, with all due respect to Christiane, the university administration a pass on this. And we should ask a lot more of our administrators to assist us and to put their money where their mouth is in this instance. So, and this comes from somebody who does a heck of a lot of outreach. I'm big into knowledge mobilization. My grant funds a digital communications journalist. I do podcasts. My grant has swag. So I'm active on Twitter. I took graduate students through writing an op-ed, so I devoted part of my summer training institute for 30 students to teach them how to write an op-ed. I did a CBC Current program on Pokemon Go, so I've been there. I do it, and at the same time, I think that it shouldn't solely be my job to do this, and that the university should help me do this. And one way they could do this, and may be painful for any of you who are university department chairs, is I think that some of our merit should be based on this outreach. I think maybe if we're having a problem with CIHR, then the university and the department should lower their expectations or stop basing the merit so much on whether or not we are successful in getting the grant. And maybe if we get those 4 S's, it would have been funded, but for lack of money, our merit should also be based on that. Because one of the problems is if we don't, then we will get a free rider problem. I mean, we have so much to do in our lives these days. we run the risk, if there isn't university and department backing for this sort of outreach, that the people who are good at it will continue to do it, and everyone else can ride along with them. Well, I'll just put my head down and do my own research, and I'm not very good at communicating with elected officials. So I think we need to reward people who do that, and we need to incentivize people who currently do not. And included in that, my last point is that the administration should be doing more in funding our social media outreach and employing less people in the Office of Sponsored Research who hook us up with industrial partners and hire journalists. And they should journalize the hell out of what we do. I'm thinking, for an example of that is Slate.com. They partner, they have a section called Future Tense in which they partner with Arizona State University. Arizona State puts a lot of money into journalism and PR for its faculty activities. So I think that the university should be funding us in part to go to Ottawa. They should fund us if we want to do Summer of Science activities. That's it for me.
I'm Tom Duchesne. I'm a associate professor in biochemistry in the Goodman Cancer Research Center. And it's actually a pleasure to be here and talk after so many great researchers and also people that are dedicated at making Canada's research better. And I'm happy. I actually perfect fit right after Renee. I've been thinking hard about how to bring something that is a bit original and goes beyond what these tremendous speakers already mentioned. And I tried to focus on what's the task at hand. And really what's at stake here is we have 3 or 4 months, 3 months, let's say, in the summer, during barbecue season, to win friends and influence people in Ottawa. We're not going to reinvent the wheel here. Okay? We have a very short amount of time, already challenging period, and we have excellent arguments. All we need to know is to identify the stakeholders, the key stakeholders, and to identify the key stakes, what's at stake, and leverage them. I would argue that the stakeholders are probably not the ministers. It's not the government. It's not even the researcher, as a matter of fact. I would argue that the main key holder, the most important one, is the Canadian community. We all are surrounded by science. We all, many of us are actually alive because of science, because of the consequences of science. We have a quality of life. Our children get cured because of science. It's all around us. Somehow, because it's such comfortable, we take it for granted. Somehow we've lost sight of how important this is. In a way, it's easy to remind people how important this is. We all have examples of how important change our life. And for me, it was asthma. For family members, it was cure for cancer. For others, it's insulin that keeps them alive or helps them manage diabetes. So, but I would argue that the most important one is, in key holders, is the public. And we've been talking about jobs and talking about votes, and it matters because the people who will take the decision have this in mind. But we haven't addressed, and we didn't come up with a plan how to sell the Naylor Report to the public. And Nicole Beauchemin here behind me was right behind me up there, and she has a track record of outreach on cancer research, spectacular one. And she was saying, are we actually, advocating for science with the public, or are we just going to make letters and op-eds that are targeted for ministers? Where are we in the media? And Renee actually just provided us the walk and the examples with social media exercise, but also radio, talk shows, presence everywhere, where we can make people aware of this. That's leverage. When you have a show on CBC or Radio-Canada that speaks about the Naylor Report, talks about commitment and how it's going to make the Canadian research community, but also the Canadian community as a whole better, politicians should listen. The other stakeholder that I wanted to mention that I really believe we should leverage are the young researchers, but also the future ones. We, as PIs, and many of you are out here, I'm sure are going to be, will agree with that. It takes 20 seconds when we talk to any researcher before we mention our trainees. Students, postdocs, research assistants, research associates, people we train and we care about, those are the ones we really care about and think about when we write our grants. Those are the ones we're worried about when we don't get our grants and we're going to make decisions that can be life-changing for their career or just downsizing in terms of quality of science. And I strongly believe that we have to move away from this negative press of self-entitlement that can be perceived as such, as if we were asking for more money to discover or have fun with stuff. The people that really matter in the end are the Canadian community and those young researchers, the next generation. And what's great, actually, is that they're already mobilized. They're already out there. They're already in the public. They master social media much better than I do, anyway. And you have examples of grassroots initiatives, like, for example, Evidence for Democracy, that was just mentioned earlier, but also Science Policy Exchange that just was born with Sean's. Beautiful initiatives like AEC, CHR that came out of that quagmire at CHR, was born out of it, but also crystallized around those early career researchers that actually mobilize and try to make things better for everyone. And by the way, they don't only advocate for early career investigators. They're entirely aware that you need a whole ecosystem in order for research to work. It's not only about the early career. You need mid-career. You need all stages of research support, and no one wants an elevator to nowhere. There's also many others. For example, the CSMB, I got to applaud what you guys do. You're quite visible. So in a way, what we need to do is actually enable those folks and be visible to those stakeholders and let them advocate for us. Move away from the spotlight and say, be one of those special interest group that whines for more money. That's not going to cut it. The young people, they're already essentially identified as a target group that the government wants to listen to. They're already wanting to be listened to. They want to talk. They really are convincing in their vibrant community. We need to be enablers as a community and get them in the press, get them in the media as much as we can. The second point I want to bring forth is the point of innovation. Innovation is on everyone's mind and mouth out there. Provincial, municipal, with the Grappe d'Innovation here in Montreal, there's quarters that are dedicated for innovation. McGill actually has a policy on innovation all over the country. Last budget, 2016, was deemed the budget for innovation. All of this for innovation. But what does really innovation mean? When you actually follow the tweets, everyone has a different definition of innovation. What I see as innovation is knowledge, new knowledge, that serves to or solves a problem. New solutions, ideas, models, technologies, techniques that solve a problem. But what they really have in mind, Minister Baines, if you track, for example, his Twitter account, what he really argues is more in favor of something that has to do with Silicon Valley. Now, there's a massive difference between them. One is a model that we know is based on speculation, on fluff and visibility, and the other one is about content. I, for one, love to believe that in Canada we have content and we are driven by solid values. And I think it's time to bring back knowledge back into innovation. Innovation without knowledge, without a solid base of trainees, highly qualified personnel, with people actually know and can call on things that don't work, that can identify alternative facts and just fluff actually out of things, but also can contribute with startups and actually fuel those initiatives that end up essentially just short-term and just sellouts and bailouts after a short period. Those are the very same trainees that I was talking about actually are so vibrant and willing to occupy that space. I think we need to leverage that innovation word that was mentioned by Janine earlier, and actually sell science for what it is. There cannot be any innovation without discovery. Like thunder follows lightning, discovery precedes innovation, and not only that, not only do you have knowledge, you have the right people ready to occupy the space and actually make that buzzword become something meaningful and long-term in commitment. They shouldn't be throwing money out of that innovation bucket without having the solid basis funded as well. That's what I'm saying. So my last point is about tone. We're researchers. We're selected and we're groomed to be critical-minded. The drawback of that is usually we can call any weakness on anything we want. And you look at the media, social media, but also a lot of the discourse, we've been set on negative thoughts, I think. We've been set on really negative discourse. What this comes out as is entitlement and people that whine for more money. Now, we have to turn the table around a bit. We have to shed that message, that image. This is an opportunity to steer research now, to leverage the new generation, to bring knowledge back into innovation now, but also to steer research in the right direction for 10, 20 years from now, with technologies, with things that we haven't even foreseen in the past. This is an opportunity. I wouldn't be one of any government that would pass by an opportunity like this. This is a blueprint that steers research and leverages the talent in Canada in a more equitable manner, because these folks are really sensitive to the issue of equity also. And I think it's an opportunity we can't pass by. The question becomes, is this government going to be the one who actually benefits and puts this name on it, or are they going to pass by an opportunity like this? So I'll close on this.
All right, tough acts to follow. So my name is Rob Annan. Most importantly about me, I'm a proud graduate of the McGill Department of Biochemistry. After finishing my PhD almost 10 years ago, I moved to Ottawa, and since then have been working in science policy. First with MITACS, where I served as Chief Research Officer, and now at the Public Policy Forum, where I'm focusing on research policy, innovation policy in a variety of different capacities. So, you know, having listened to all of the panelists so far, there's not a lot to take issue with. And so I've been trying to think, well, where can I add value? And I think really what I'll focus on is my experience in the last 10 years of being in Ottawa and working very closely with government in terms of first with MITACS and its priorities, but also more recently on a variety of other subjects. And to talk a little bit about what it means to work productively with the government, having been through the budget cycle a half dozen times, having a sense of kind of how that works, what messaging works, and so on. Everything I'm hearing is, I think, exactly right in terms of how to engage, but the messaging could maybe use a little nuance. So I think that's where I'll spend my time. First, a couple of comments about the report, and Jim did a good job of, I think, summarizing it. It is long, but it's actually really good, I think. The executive summary is certainly worth reading if you haven't, but there's lots of great information in there all the way through. But to me, the important thing about the report isn't so much the details or the 35 recommendations. To me, there are two big themes in the report that I think are resonating in government. The first is funding. Obviously, there is a funding gap. The report takes pains to explain how and why and so on, but that's, I think, not that hard an argument to make. I think that in Ottawa there is a recognition that, you know, there may well be a gap. Whether we need to do something about it is a different question, which we'll get to, but the gap is the first thing, and the second one is around governance. The report makes specific recommendations around NACRI and sort of coordinating councils and so on, but I think the take-home message is that there's a governance issue as well. And so, to my mind, those are the two big kind of buckets that the government's going to be thinking about as it receives the Naylor Report. And I think it's worthwhile to just take a break and take a step back, and for us to recognize as well that the government is going to receive, this isn't a government report. This is an independent expert advisory report that's now been given to the government. So the government is going to have to interpret this through their own lenses, through their own priorities, and so on. And so taking that step back allows us perhaps to think about, okay, if I'm in the government, what am I looking at? What am I going to do about this? I will tell you, even the very best reports don't get adopted whole cloth. They just don't, right? So by way of context, this isn't to minimize the need for us to speak with a common voice and so on, but just to set some expectations. There are, apart from, I guess, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, which the government did say it would accept effectively unconditionally, we'll see how it actually rolls out. But by and large, reports don't just get adopted. So this is going to be a process. This is the beginning of a conversation. And when one thinks about the government and its current slate of issues and priorities, you put up basic research funding against renegotiating NAFTA, and you wonder where the Prime Minister and the PMO's energy is going to go, right there. So it's cutting through the noise is going to be a challenge. And so I think we need to recognize all of that and do our best to kind of move the needle and get it onto the agenda, but also to recognize, because strategically it allows you to make better decisions about where to put your efforts, where to put your energies, and also kind of how to expect what success is actually going to look like. I want to say off the top that I don't think there's any question that we have a champion in Minister Duncan. She really would, she would like to go even further, frankly, in my opinion. She would probably like to go further than the report would go in terms of funding for research and so on. It would be, in my mind, a mistake for us to focus our energies on trying to increase her passion for this cause. I think it's worth thinking about the case she is making to her colleagues around the cabinet table, to her colleagues in other departments. The key people making this decision are not in the Minister of Science's office. To some degree, it's Minister Baines, but by and large, this is going to be Minister Morneau and the Prime Minister, and they make the decisions around the budget. So it's going to be, when we're thinking about how to engage, we have to think about the messages that are going to resonate with the Finance Minister, to some degree with the Prime Minister's office and the Prime Minister. And so it's not a case of just saying, we need to make a better case for science to the Science Minister. That would be, in my mind, a serious mistake. I also think, and this has been mentioned, and I really want to take a moment to underline the importance of making the case to your university administration, because there is a very active and very effective university lobby in Ottawa. It is not always, it's not always maybe visible, and it may not always align perfectly with the individual priorities of the researchers, say, in this room, but Universities Canada, U15, CAUT, and others are active in Ottawa. At least insofar as Universities Canada and U15 are concerned, they are constituted via university administrators, by and large the presidents. University presidents have a large set of priorities. I don't need to explain that to you. The Naylor Report currently, as far as I can tell, is certainly the #1 priority of each organization in Ottawa, but they're still balancing that out against other possible priorities, including superclusters and so on. You need to make the case very strongly so that your university president knows that this community absolutely 100% wants to see her advocacy for Naylor, because that will carry a lot of weight, both in one-on-one meetings that the presidents are having with politicians, but also via those advocacy organizations. On the messaging, there's a lot of messaging in the Naylor Report itself. There's a lot of cases being made for why there's underinvestment, why there are governance issues, and so on and so forth. It's going to be important. This case has been made already. It's important to, in effect, cherry pick some of that messaging to suit the audience. I will tell you that the messages that may resonate most strongly within the community, things like falling success rates, things like falling shares of federal funding for research and so on, do not resonate with political staff in Ottawa. Those are inside baseball types of measures, right? There are concerns, and there may be some superficial concern to that sort of thing, but arguing that university professors aren't successful enough in their funding, frankly, university professors are not a disadvantaged group. Right? When you come to Ottawa and you say, we need funding because our success rates are falling, and you layer that up against real concerns that the government is trying to address when it comes to Indigenous communities, when it comes to youth at risk, when it comes to, you name it, any number of health issues and so on, it's a tough case to make when you're coming from the perspective of, we need to do more because we don't have the resources we once had. Right? But there are major messaging, there's major messaging potential that aligns with the government. The government tells us every day what it is trying to do. This is one of the things I had to learn when I first went to Ottawa and I first got involved in working with government and advocacy and so on. Government sets priorities during elections. They release platforms. They have speeches from the throne. They have budgets. news releases, they're constantly telling you what their priorities are. They're not subtle about it. We can scoff at the emptiness of political rhetoric when it comes to middle class, but that matters to them, and it matters because they made the case to the voters that this is what they would do. And in a democratic society, they have to deliver, in theory, they have to deliver in order to get reelected. The Naylor Report, to my mind, is a very technical, almost a technocratic report, and we can say this would solve the problem, let's implement it. But in a democracy, it actually goes to the people to make the decisions about what those priorities should be. And there's this tension between those two. So I think what we need to recognize, and the case has been made here before, that we need to understand what the government is telling us. And those priorities are pretty simple. One, jobs. Right? This is the priority of literally every government, actually. So this was the government, the Harper government's #1 concern, and it remains a major concern, if not the #1 concern for the Liberal government. So we want to be speaking in the language of jobs, and I think the case has been made here that there's a direct impact on jobs, this investment. There's also lots of spin-off when it comes to things like innovation and downstream commercialization and so on. I think the #1 issue, and this is a case where there's just a lack of, there's ignorance. There's real ignorance in the political class and in the public as to what happens to research grants. I think there's an assumption that a research grant is awarded and it goes in your pocket to, who knows what, right? To buy bigger calculators or, what have you. I don't think people recognize how much of that research funding goes to training students and postdocs. This is HQP funding. You just pull a budget off the shelf from any of the last 5 or 6 years. Skills and training is a key element of any one of these budgets. And what kind of skills and training? Skills and training for young people in jobs for the knowledge economy, for the economy of tomorrow, all these buzzwords. That's what you do. That's what we do here at a university, right? We train people in cutting-edge things. We train people to be thoughtful and critical, analytical, all of these important things, right? David may be upset that I'm no longer doing yeast biochemistry and protein signaling and so on, but I carry with me in the work I'm doing now the education I received here in my PhD because that training matters, right? So this is a case, basic research funding helped pay for my training, and it pays for training of thousands and thousands of students. So that's a case that needs to be made very, very clearly. Another issue here, and again, I understand the need that we don't want to cherry pick from the report, but the science minister in particular is signaling strongly that equity is a major concern. And she's signaling this not just because it's a concern of hers, but because this is a concern of the government's. So what we're talking about now is women in science, we're talking about indigenous scholarship, we're talking about underrepresented groups. And the point was made, this community doesn't need government funding to get on board with that. Work in partnership with governments, walk in and say, we are committed to doing this. How can we make it clear that you are making progress on this file? Let's do this together, gives them a win and creates a partnership. The last thing I'll say here is understand that a message that is not going to resonate is the idea that unfettered funding should be given to the research councils and then basically hands-free government just trust the community to do what it wants. I understand the need for this. I understand how the advantages of having investigator-driven research, absolutely. But there is, one of the reasons we've seen this multiplication of so-called boutique funding programs and so on is because the government wants to be able to point to certain things and say, we are investing in AI, we are investing in clean tech, we are investing in climate change. These are the priorities of the government as well. So how can we as a community square this circle around investigator-driven research, while at the same time recognizing broad areas of research priority so the government can say, look what we've done in high-tech areas like AI or clean tech or whatever. That's, I think, a major challenge, but one that if we can figure out, we build a partnership between the community and government rather than a kind of arm's-length relationship. And in partnership, both sides win because the government gets to say, look what we're doing in terms of skills training, in terms of climate change and other research priorities, and the community still has the opportunity to pursue a broad scope of research within those areas. The last thing I'll say, just to finish off, is that we ignore the public at our peril. And this point has been made already, and I think communication is really important. Thomas was just talking a little bit about this as well. There's lots of ways to do it, right? There's lots of, Twitter people in the room. I serve on the board of Let's Talk Science, which is a real sort of community engagement organization. But even beyond that, we need to start thinking about ways, how do we involve, look at the composition of the panel that put this report together, right? This is the by and large, the eminence grise of the science community in Canada. There's a risk of entitlement and elitism charges that I think undermine the success when it comes to a government like the Liberals, who are trying to hold off the populist wave we see in other countries. So how do we say, no, we hear this is not, these are all tired stereotypes, but nonetheless, we are not stuck in some ivory tower. We are engaging with the public. We want to be responsive and permeable here, and we need to figure out both sides in order to really advance the agenda, in order to get the government on our side, rather than just to sort of badger them into making the funding allocation. So I'll leave it at that, and happy to take any questions later on specifics.
So I'm Nathalie Grimbaud from University of Montreal, a biochemist, and also working at the hospital at the CHUM. So I have the challenge to close this panel and try not to repeat so much what was said today, but maybe what I will do is put a different angle on some of the discussion that we had today. First of all, we just want to follow up on many things that have been said by Tom and Rob, sorry, and which is something that I strongly believe that we need to change the way the public and, of course, the politicians are seeing science field. For now, most of the time, they see us like a bunch of kids, basically, wanting, like you said, new toys, and we will publish a paper that will stay on a shelf and nobody except a few people in the world will read. That's basically how they see us. And we need to change that, because what we discussed, and Christian mentioned that also earlier, is that basically each lab is like a small company. When you look at your budget, sometimes with the cut that we have from the funding agency, 80% of our budget is going to salary support for, we mentioned a lot today, the students being undergraduate, graduate, or postdoctoral fellow. But I think one of the important part of also our budget is going to research professionals. And we don't hear so much about these people, and I think they are very important people in science. They are the memory of science in Canada. Like the students, we loved working with them, but they come and go, and that's the purpose of why they are in our lab. We want to train them, so we need to let them go, as hard as it is to let them go sometimes. But the professional people, we need them, and they have to be long-term. And so I think one of the important things is to sell the fact that we are the funding coming from the federal government is mainly funding jobs. Yes, it's funding science, but it's funding jobs. And I'm happy to see that some of the youngest people are here in the room, but we need you on board to talk to the public and to the politicians. We can speak for you, but the first people who are concerned by the jobs that we are losing if the funding is not there is you. And so what I suggest is that we talk to all our colleagues at every level. We speak about also the professional in our lab, but just think about all the people around you in a research center or university that we need to make our lab working, like the person who is washing your dish when you have a wet lab. This person is a job. She or he is a job, and all these people need to get involved with us to talk to the politicians and the public. It's a reality. They are part of science. We tend to exclude a lot of people, and we tend to stay between the PIs and the students and postdocs, but there are many, many other people that needs to get involved. So I strongly suggest that if you can spread the word of this initiative around your institutions, at every level, that will make a point to the MPs that you can meet. We suggested, Michael mentioned that we go as a group to meet our MPs. We can go as a group of PIs, but there again, I suggest you bring the people from your lab with you. Talk to them. Like we mentioned at the very beginning, that we need to make that personal, and we have to give silent examples. That's the best way to do that. So that probably will bring me to an example that I had to see recently. So with the initiative of some PIs from the South Shore, who lives in the South Shore of Montreal, some from McGill, some from University of Montreal, they went to meet their MP, Alexandra Mendez, and based on the discussion from this PI with this MP, we got to a few people from PIs from McGill and University of Montreal, so Michael was there, Ken is there too. We got to meet with the science minister. She came to Montreal and she gave us an hour and a half to meet her, and students and postdocs were with us. And I can tell you from the meeting that we had that what she will remember is when this graduate student told her that the week before she met with her PI saying, so a PI had to say, you know, we're getting out of funding, but don't worry, you will finish your PhD. But that was at the cost of letting the research assistant go. And when she said that, you know, things became very real, because before we were telling the science minister that labs were going to close because of the funding situation. And then every time she was kind of reacting, but do you have examples? Is it a reality? Because we hear a lot about that, but they don't have concrete example of that. So I think making it personal, and like the people who have lost their job, because the lab closing is one thing, but how many people have lost their job in the community of science is what is important for the politicians. And I was just discussing that before. Remember that this government is already in the second phase. They want to be re-elected. Job is what will count, and all these people in science won't vote for them if they don't think that they are doing a good job for the field. So I just want also to go back to this meeting that we had with the chance to have with the science minister, and maybe put a bit of nuances of what we discussed before, and Jim has mentioned, especially with the letter that she sent. So I completely agree with you. The feeling that we have is that she's a champion and she's an ally for us in Ottawa. The first thing that I got from this meeting was that we tend to forget, is that she is not in charge of CIHR. It's not in her mandate. So we have to also talk with the other MPs, of course, MP Banks, and also Jen Philpott, who's actually involved more for the CIHR, but we need to remember that. She's one player. She's our ally, but she's not everything. And basically the message that she had, and that maybe explain a little bit what she wrote in a very, I agree, strange way. What she said is that when she's trying to fight for us, is that she's sitting with these 30 or so other MPs, and because of what happened, and Jim explained that the priorities of the government has changed, is the way she phrased it was that the government doesn't want to increase the overall budget now. So basically what she said is that if I ask for money, someone else has to let some money go. That's the way the government is working for now. But that's for this year. We need to my opinion, spread the message that for 2018, we don't want to steal the money from someone else. We just need to make a case for science, and that it's investment for the future. We have so many, had so many good examples of that just before. So I think of course, we need to have a united voice and for the whole report, but we need to make the case that this is an investment. Like jobs, to my opinion, is the best way to sell it to the politician at this phase and of this government and with the overall situation in the world. So that's basically the message that she had I got from this meeting. So basically, just she needs us to help her sell the case of science. That's basically what she said. You have to help me. I'm on your side, but you need to help me. And she basically said, go and meet your MPs, go and meet the public. So that's one thing. So the last point that I wanted to discuss is that we talked a lot about the fact that we need to be positive, and that's true. We cannot keep going and complain all the time. As you said, and which is true, we kind of privileged in the whole Canadian society. So we need to explain why we need more funding. But in another way, we said we need to be positive, but there is a danger in being positive. If we say, oh, everything is great, we do good science and everything is good to our MPs, then we'll end up asking, so why do you need money? Why do you need more money? So I think we need to turn that a positive way, like saying, what can we do better if we had more? You know, we already do good with what we have, but we can be more competitive. Like the competitiveness is also something that the government is really listening to. So we need to, well, maybe I don't have the best way of saying that, and some people are better equipped to talk with the politician about this aspect. But I think we have to be careful and also tell them with salient example what happened since the funding decreased, what we lost. And for my opinion, that's jobs that we lost the most. So I will conclude on that and we'll be happy to have questions.
So I'm going to open it up in a second, but we're supposed to have lunch at 12:15. So what I propose is that we just eat and talk, okay? So you have 15 minutes before lunch is ready, and maybe we let the panelists go one or two at a time to get their lunch so that they're not all gone, but they don't have to wait till... Yeah, well, that's what I was going to do. 12:15. Let's stick with that. So you can slowly move, grab lunch, come back, and then we'll just have a talk. We have the room until 2, and so you know, let's talk. And thank you again to the second group of panelists. And for the first group, well, now we open it up to a broader conversation about everything we've heard this morning. So with that.
I've already introduced myself, so I don't have to do that again. Thank you very much to all the speakers today, and I'm very impressed by the energy and enthusiasm with which you exhort us all to mobilize in favor of the report. I appreciate also the fact that we have to be realistic. We have to deal with politicians who are short-termers, who are concerned about employment. We have to be better PR people. We have to put out glossy and accessible stories that are personalized, et cetera, et cetera. So I appreciate all that in the name of realism. But I think there's a trap there as well, a potential trap. If we keep on emphasizing the short-term, immediate, commercializable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, products that science eventually produces, we play right into the hands of the short-termers who have been pushing us more and more and more towards applied research rather than fundamental research. And the real issue, the fundamental issue of the Naylor Report, it seems to me, is that there has been this drift away from support for fundamental research. Not only for fundamental research, but from of course, research in general. And so all these short-term attempts to influence our politicians with the short-term arguments do not address that fundamental issue. What has happened, I think, over the last 20-odd or more years, I've particularly seen this in the European Commission's funding policies, but it's drifted over to across the Atlantic since then, is what I would call the closing of the Einsteinian window. There was a period, maybe starting from the end of the Second World War onwards, where both the politicians and the public were convinced of the story that says that if you just let those academics play in their sandboxes, do their fundamental research, the outcomes, of course, are uncertain. You never know what will come out, but from time to time, the results are so huge, the benefits are so enormous that it's worth the investment. That was a conviction that was widespread among the public and politicians for maybe 40 years. And then that window slowly but surely closed. There was more and more emphasis on short term, on what does it do, on how do you mobilize this knowledge, on what innovations can we get out of it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What does it do for employment? And it is that perception that has changed that we must address if we ever want to have a long-term solution to the problem of losing our support for fundamental research. And there aren't very many obvious solutions to that. But there's one thing, I'm reminded of a short campaign that SSHRC ran that I was more or less involved in I think around 2004 or so, where SSHRC decided that they wanted to raise the profile of the social sciences because they were worried about their funding situation, as always. And they started putting out to the press, because only one or two of you has mentioned journalists, but journalists are a hugely important part of whatever campaign we can mount. They started to issue daily reports to the press about various things that social scientists had come up with that were beneficial. And for a while, that worked. It showed up in the Globe and Mail and the National Post and so on and so forth. Now, I don't see why we couldn't jointly, U15 or the various federations and associations, put together a tiny little bit of money to form a center of people who are specializing in spreading the word about the link between fundamental research, the often unbelievably serendipitous links between fundamental research in the long term and remarkable outcomes later on. My friend Dan Guiton loves the story about the sex life of the screw worm. You know, it's a famous story about how Senator Proxmire used that particular research to ridicule fundamental science as all worthless, we're throwing money away, and so on and so forth. And then 20 or 30 years later, that research became crucial in saving the bovine industry billions of dollars. Right? It's a classic, but there are hundreds of stories like that. And those are the stories that we really need to spread to the public, because that is the public ultimately, as many of you have emphasized, public ultimately is, or the attitudes of the public ultimately, is what the MPs are concerned about. If we can change that around, but that's a long-term process, of course, obviously. This is not short-term, a short-term strategy. But if we can turn that around, then eventually we can address the real issue that underlies the Naylor Report, and that we've been struggling with for 25 years or more. Sorry.
Okay, so you think it's bad to promote basic science, try social sciences and humanities, and trying to get elected officials and the public to think that that's relevant. So yeah, it's especially hard for those of us in the social sciences and humanities, and I'm at somewhat of an advantage because I also work in computation. But I think that one of the things we can do is user stories and use cases. And we can talk about the way in which we're involved in creativity and soft skills and interdisciplinarity and childlike discovery. I think that we have a lot that we can say about the ways in which we encourage people to expand their thinking. And a final point is, we often think that journalists come to us with a story and they want someone to interview. Journalists need stories, so they're not opposed to you pitching a story to them. So we can create as Axel is suggesting. We can create a whole bunch of stories that attract them, and they will come to us.
Just maybe one word about this, Axel. It resonates a lot with some of the thoughts I had. The application for basic research and the opposition or the perceived opposition between basic and applied research has been around forever. Santiago Ramon y Cajal in 1916 wrote a chapter's name is Beginner's Mistake about research. And in there, he actually was saying that it's completely nonsense and obvious why you shouldn't oppose both. It was actually a direct echo to what I was mentioning. If you want innovation, you need knowledge, you need people that know, you need people that think in the long term, you need people that actually add substance to a buzzword. It's not about selfies, right? We need to fill that space with knowledge. It's now. What I'm saying, though, is that this is a long-term goal. It's built on scientific culture. I mean, you have the MBL in Europe, for example, where you get in the laboratories and actually a bunch of companies funding basic research institute. People here, I'm wondering if actually it's possible. It can be done, but you need to have a solid knowledge of science. You need to spread the word, and actually, this is long-term. The way I view what we're trying to do here is actually a very, very acute exercise. Getting the Naylor Report accepted as much as possible, we want for the entirety this fall, before it becomes fixed for the next budget. I'm with you with that problem, but I think it's long-term. And every time I have an occasion to mention how basic research has changed lives, going from, I don't know, insulin to CRISPR, I will. But I think it's longer term.
I'll say two quick things. One, on the question of long-termism, I think my experience, and I've spoken with ministers of science, finance, industry, and so on in both the Harper government and in this government, they personally see the value of long-term investments in research. There's no question in my mind. I know the Harper government certainly got, a fair degree of quite fair criticism for decisions, but when you talk to Minister Flaherty or you talk to, most people around the cabinet table, personally, by and large, they are products of the university system. They have kids going to university. This is the educated class. And so there are exceptions. But by and large, personally, they see the value. The fact is they have to make budget decisions. And those budget decisions are driven by the priorities of the government of the day and what they think will reelect them. So I agree with regards. Now, in terms of long-termism, like the other side is, of course, the Einsteinian window, right, was built coming out of World War II, where the whole world, and certainly the Western world, saw the value of the investments they had made in basic research applied in a very serious and consequential way. And so it's maybe not surprising that over time that sort of the resonance of that has sort of diminished, but it was really coming out of World War II and Vannevar Bush in the United States who set the tone for public research policy by saying we will continue the investments in basic research, by and large driven by those applications. So I think that the two have always been linked. I don't think there's ever really, apart from, I guess, Victorian individual patrons who just funded research for its own sake, by and large there's always been a link between application and investment. But your point is absolutely right. Finally, on the question of journalism, there's the Science Media Centre of Canada works to try to increase science literacy in the media, but of course journalists can't get anyone to read anything these days, which is a whole other issue, right? So when it comes to media, there's lots of other problems, never mind just regarding science.
So a few years ago, Research Canada did a poll where they found some overwhelming majority to the tune of 85–90% of people they talked to said that they were in favor of the federal government supporting basic research, even if it had no immediate economic or health benefits or things like that. So sometimes, because I think the public does have this very fundamentally positive response to curiosity-driven science, even if it's not about dinosaurs or black holes, and if you do these outreach events for the public, sure, it's a self-selected group, but people are very enthusiastic about these things. Why there's this perception among politicians that basic research is like a losing position for them politically?
I'll just quickly point out that the government does support basic research to the tune of $3.5 billion a year still, right? So there is an investment being made, and what we're talking about is an increment now, and to my mind, the downside of accruing deficits just simply overwhelms the upside of making the investment. In the calculations that they're doing, I think we can move that needle. I don't think there's any doubt, and we can I think, make good use of that broad support. But this is, I mean, in a way, this is the challenge, right? It's not like, you know, we're not going back into the 90s where we're talking about massive cuts to science and we have to save science. Like, this is, I understand the messaging is around, we are in a crisis, but if you're in the government and you're saying, well, look, like, okay, so it's been flat, but there's other areas where we've been cutting, there are others where we may have to cut, you know, what's the additional benefit we get for a 30% increase in basic research? I'm not endorsing that opinion, I'm just saying I think that's the calculus.
The Federation of Quebec Professors is organizing a publicity campaign to raise the profile of university professors. And, I think the best example of that is that most of us have met people as summer approaches and they ask us, well, what are you going to do for your holidays? And so it's hard to believe that the vision of the population regarding what we are does not have to be somehow expanded. And so that's why the Federation of Quebec Professors is going to run a publicity campaign, and they've hired a company to do this, and they don't have the money to do it on television, but they will do it on social media, etc. And so I thought an interesting question would be, what would you suggest would be a good publicity campaign to enhance the public image of the university professor?
Find hooks. Right, so I was on The Current and I talked about Pokemon Go, but really I was talking about race and class digital divides. And also I can't extol the utility of social media platforms like Twitter and other things enough, because most of my media inquiries come because I'm tweeting a lot about something. So basically, I mean, Michael mentioned dinosaurs, so find your equivalent of a dinosaur, write a little thing about it, and send it to CBC or Radio Canada or the Gazette or the Globe and Mail, and hey, summer for them is often really slow, and they'll pick it up.
I would state that there are examples of how to actually strike the mind of anyone, a layperson in public, is to speak to emotions. People vote and decide and orient the decisions based on emotions more than reason. So if you take examples of things that change their lives, I mentioned the incident, for example, you could talk about antibiotics, you can talk about treatments for cancer. It touches people's lives. And right off when you mention that, they see their loved ones, they see their family. You could also speak to training and education, because this is the future, simply. It's not even a buzz, it's actually the reality. So training people and with the best science possible, positioning them to lead, positioning them to change, foresee and change the world, right? Because that's what basic research does. Sees the future, and innovation after actually steers it. But actually you have to restrike with emotions, I think, and link personal stories and personal interests and how people's lives have been changed with science. And I think it's really easy when you think about it.
Maybe I can add a word. I agree with you that we need to speak about the output of science, but I think it's already well done. And we hear a lot about that. You know, we have a lot of broadcasts and TV shows speaking about what science is doing. But I agree with what you just mentioned, is that the public, and even surprisingly, it happened to me recently, undergraduate students, they don't know what a university professor is doing. What is our job exactly? So, and also when I finished teaching in the fall session, they just wished me like good holidays and, you know, what are you gonna do now? Okay, so, and now the president of the undergraduate student association asked me to write a text about what is a university professor doing. So if you can imagine that the students who are at the university don't know what we're doing, what is our job exactly, can you imagine from the world public? So I think it's important to also spread the word of what we are doing. And also a disconnection that we see, that I hear a lot from the people I talk to, is that for them, a university professor is not a researcher, it's two different people. And we need to make this connection. So I think also spreading the word of what every person in science is doing, like we talk about the professor, but also what is a research associate doing in a lab, what is a research assistant doing. You know, we need to speak about what we do, what is our job, and not just teaching and then being on holidays. So.
The last thing I'll say about that, and all that's great, I'll just mention that a lot of times researchers have activities that are happening, outside of the university's political riding, right? So you might have a research station out in the Eastern Townships, or maybe you're working with a community, an underserviced community somewhere, up in northern Quebec or what have you. Being able to loop your local MP into that activity by just saying, you know what, we're doing this, they often don't know. And to say, we're doing this really interesting project with a community in your riding, and we're gonna be there. If you wanna come by, I'd be happy to show you around. It sounds almost crass, but there's real value in it for the MP, or MPP for that matter, or MLA, because that individual wants to be seen to be doing good, wants to be able to demonstrate the value of their government's activity in their community. So being able to show up and say, look, I just toured this salmon research center that's looking at restoring salmon populations in these clean streams. I got my picture taken next to the river with a bunch of smiling grad students, and it's in the local newspaper. That is just gold. And it sounds like, I'm not saying to be sort of opportunistic with it. There's value in that for everybody. You want your local parliamentarian to know what's happening in their community and to see the value of the investments they're making. And so that kind of thing, you'll often find that their offices are very interested, even if just to know what's happening in their riding. So if you have something happening, it's different if every single one of you in this room contacts the local riding person here for downtown Montreal, it's a bit different. But if you have something that's happening a little bit outside the region, you can find a champion.
Thank you very much. I guess I'm very focused on action until the next budget, right? So I guess my question to you, based on your allocution and your experience in public policy, it sounded to me like you were saying that one of the best ways for us to get the biggest bang for the buck would be to rally with our administration when they write their recommendation to the Parliament Commission on budget, or did I misunderstand that? And could you give me your top 3 priority action list for us to do until the next budget? Because that's really an insight that I think you have and that we need.
So, I think the number one thing I would say is make sure you're absolutely clear to your university leadership, president, generally, that this is an absolute priority for you and that you are ready to help, right? You're ready to share in the effort, but that this is really, really, don't take it, and now this is hypothetically speaking, I'm not talking about the president here particularly, but don't take it for granted that they're in there beating the drums for the Naylor Report. I can guarantee you that the Naylor Report and its recommendations will be the #1 priority in terms of budget asks for the major university advocacy groups in Ottawa. It always is anyways. Tri-Council funding has been the #1 ask from AUCC and Universities Canada for as long as I can remember. So that will be there, but giving it the extra push so that your university president has to come back and explain why it didn't happen, is an uncomfortable situation. You want to make sure that they understand that you're 100% behind it. Secondly, I do think that there's value in engaging as in the variety of mechanisms, whatever everyone's not going to be comfortable, booking an appointment with their MP and sitting down and saying, here's what I would like to see happen. Maybe instead what you'll do is you'll write a letter, you'll make a phone call, write a letter to the editor, just tweeting things on social media. The staff pay attention to these things, right? So buzz definitely helps. And then frankly, these kinds of events, reaching out and coordinating, gives the impression, look, the Science Minister's office knows this meeting is happening today. They were very aware of the meeting in Toronto. They're interested in knowing what happens coming out of these meetings. They want to take the temperature of the community. You know, I'm not in any kind of position with regards to speaking on behalf of the community, with regards to whether or not protests should happen or whether or not other kinds of actions, but these kinds of conversations here keep the community at least in the same page. And so I think that through the summer, staying engaged, however it happens, will also be important because information needs to be shared and things can change. Things can change, right? So depending on the mood, depending on the opportunity, come September, October, November, you know, there might be opportunities that we can't anticipate yet to take action or what have you. So, but to my mind, the universities speaking with one voice are very, very effective in Ottawa. And being able to make sure that your university is aligning with the others on this Naylor Report and that they know they have the faculty behind them will be also very important.
Rob, in line with Janine's intervention, if I may, we discussed the fact that the science minister is already advocating, already listening to the community, and we discussed essentially who are actually the people that we could convince, that we couldn't win over before next fall when the budget is set. And so maybe it'd be smart to start identifying the people we should be writing into and not send more letters to people who already won. And you mentioned Morneau, you mentioned Baines, and there's Philpott also who runs CIHR. But in terms of budget, there cannot be any more direct influence than Morneau. So do you think we should target some of them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the ministries will be, the way that it works, right, the ministries themselves put together their own priorities that they then submit. So organizations and individuals submit into the sort of budget process in a variety of ways. There's the official submissions that were already pointed out here on August 4th to the Parliamentary Finance Committee. So this is to say, you know what, we want the committee to consider these ideas and so on. But each department also submits a request to the finance minister that says we're requesting funds for these priorities within our department. And so there's also an advocacy level in terms of asking departments or trying to get onto the ask list for the various departments, right? So to my mind, and then so Morneau, in the end, is the one who will sit down and craft the budget, or has responsibility for crafting the budget with the Prime Minister and then with Cabinet more broadly. But it helps to have a champion at the table. The Science Minister will be the champion, but her influence is potentially limited by her role. I think Minister Baines is probably the one. He has he's launched the Supercluster Initiative now, so that is exciting, and it's going to be a big piece of the puzzle. But that's no longer a budget issue for him. So I think there might be an angle to be able to say, you know what, the Supercluster Initiative is great, and you know that money is going to flow to the universities. The government's not going to give that money to companies. Companies have to put that same amount of money back into the system. So that money is going to go into the universities for its, you know, very much applied kind of superclustery things. I think there's an argument to be made to say, you know what, the science community is ready to stand behind Minister Baines and the innovation agenda. What we need to do now is build out that pipeline. And I know the pipeline metaphor is tired and incorrect, but nonetheless, this idea that we've taken care of this end, we have to take care of this end, we're behind you, Minister Baines, let's do something on that side as well. The science minister is aligned too. So there, to my mind, that's one potential avenue. But then, of course, there's also, you know, you still have to be talking to the finance minister as well as the officials within the government and the political staff. So it's a very complicated ecosystem, which is why I think working through the structures that already exist in terms of the administration and their GR functions as well as the associations is probably the only way that the community is going to be able to hit all of those bases.
Thank you. Just to say that, just before you talk, Nicole, just to say that you can go get lunch, come back, and just, so we have to be out by 2, so if you want to eat, get your lunch, come back, and then we can continue our discussion. Not just, but I will ask the panelists to not go all together. So.
I just want to say thanks to those of you who are live tweeting this.
So I'm Nicole Beauchemin, and I've had 15 years now of communicating with the public in various forms or shapes. I'll start with a question because I would like an answer. Is there a one-page summary distilled for lay public of the Naylor Report? And if so, where can we get it? Because, I mean, if we're going to go out there, either to MPs or to the public to try and promote this, it would be great to have one and the same story to tell and to use whatever is going to be most media effective. I fully agree with, I'm sorry I didn't quite catch your name, but the fact that we need to use the media. It's summer, they have nothing to do, nothing to report. It's easy to get on their case and just pursue them. And I think we have the multiplying effect of the public. And it's great that we tackle the ministers and the MPs, but I think the most effective people to push issues end up being the public. I'll just give you one example of what's happening right now. The law that was passed by the federal government on the right to live. And all of this now has been building up. In Quebec here, we're trying to get this to go further, and it's coming out in the media with personal stories of ministers or prominent people whose family members are dying of this and that, or trying to get help to die, and it's not coming out. And this is now being, you can see it being pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed so that the federal law be amended to get this more prominently onto the schedule. I think it's the same thing here. If we have a multiplying effect from the public, I think we have better chances of pushing this in the 3 to 4 months we have to put it on the agenda.
Maybe I can just, or maybe Michael, you want to do it. I think what the Association of Canadian Early Career Health Researchers have done with the link that was given to you in the program, with the one-page summary, we will find everything you need to contact the public or the MPs, and so they have done a wonderful job with that. So I think you will find everything you need. Michael, do you want to add something on that? Okay.
It's Summer of Research, right? Summer of Research?
Summer of Science Canada.
Summer of Science Can.
Yeah,
That's
it's on the program, the link. Yeah, so.
One quick addition to that, Evidence for Democracy will have a sort of one-page summary that we're using for the public about the Naylor Report and why it's important. So that will be online this week. And also on our website, on the note about do you contact Morneau or who do you write to, we'll have a sort of form letter that you can edit, which would go to your MP, but would also copy Morneau, Phil Pott, the Prime Minister. So basically, your MP would hear about it from writing to you, but it's also copied to all the relevant ministers. So that's kind of the route we're going as well.
So maybe now's a good time for you guys to go grab your lunch. Okay. So just by way of trying to wrap things up while you have your lunch, first of all, again, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for taking time out of their busy lives to come and participate. I'd like to thank all of you for coming to participate. And I'd just like to kind of have a few minutes where we talk about next steps. So the three things that we were after here were how do we engage our politicians? I think we've heard some good ideas about how to do that, right? The Summer of Science, website has basically provided the resources to interact with your MP. To answer Nicole's question, it's also provided a sort of lay summary of the Naylor Report that you can use to start engaging the public. I think so. There's three sorts of groups that we have to engage. We've talked about engaging politicians. We've talked about engaging the public. But what Jim just said to me resonated greatly is that we have to remain engaged with each other because it's not something that's going to go away anytime soon. Right? So this idea that all of us in a different way, but with the same sort of voice, with the same sort of messaging, we have to kind of push for this to be made a reality. I mean, the argument that it's an incremental request of an already well-funded sort of science ecosystem, it's true. It's what we're up against. But I think at the same time, there's good arguments that can be made to say that if we don't do it now, it will cost us a great deal in the future. It will cost us a great deal in the near future, in that generations of trainees will no longer think that when I finish my PhD, I want to do research. I'm going to go into some other profession. I'm going to take the skills that I learned and I'm going to use them to do something else. I think that, to me, is the biggest risk that we face, is that we're going to lose generations. And then after we're gone, when there's no one left to do this, who teaches the next generation, right? It's something that could spiral into a catastrophic loss for Canadian science. So I worry about that a lot, and I think that that's the selling point for me, is that we're not only solving problems of society, but we're preserving a sort of we're preserving and extending the knowledge economy. We're making it possible for the knowledge economy to exist, and that one of the things that we do most importantly is train students, is create positions for career scientists as research associates, as research assistants. I don't think we can make too much, or we can make too little of that idea, that we need to really push that idea. Sorry, I'll rephrase that. I don't think we can make too much of that idea. That idea has to be pushed far, right? I mean, we do generate a lot. There are a lot of economic benefits. There are a lot of benefits to having a society that is educated, literate, critical, analytical, all of these things you heard today. So I think I'll let David speak for himself after he's finished, but I think one of the things that we wanted to start is continue the cycle of op-eds that come out of these meetings, the ones that come out of Toronto and all of the other sites that the meetings to have the Naylor Report recommendations implemented across the country. I think that that's something that has to bubble through everything we write, everything we say all summer. And the last thing I'll say is, and I'll give you a chance to say it yourself, Jim, but Jim said that it can't just be the same voices all the time. It has to be multiple voices. It has to be through multiple venues, social media, journalists, print journalists, digital journalists. It has to be through the universities. The universities have to kind of step up, and maybe we can help them, but by providing them with material or by providing them with assurances that we want them to get their indirect costs levels raised as part of what we want as one of the Naylor recommendations suggests, right? I think that will make them a lot more. Well, they should be able anyway, but for whatever reason they have not been able in the past. I think we have to kind of work with them to be on the same page in the future. So I don't know. So I'll ask Dave to come up and say a few words in conclusion as well. Once again, thank you, everyone, and I hope that we can produce something that we can distribute to you, that you can distribute far and wide, and that you can use to become those voices.
Great. Well, thanks, Terry, for doing all the organization of this. So a couple of words of encouragement for the people with getting funded or not getting funded, I guess, by the CHR, is that the CHR is, very soon there will be a big announcement that they're going back to the old system. If you want to know what the old system is, it's a little bit like Groundhog Day. Just watch Groundhog Day for a few times, and anyway, I think that's good news. The bad news is, of course, there's no extra money. Rod McInnes will be, we're meeting, the College of Reviewers is meeting in Ottawa 26th and 27th, and I think Rod McInnes will be here on the 28th at UDM and also at McGill, and I think this sort of announcement will come out. So that's nice. The other good news is, although she can't be here today, is our new VP Research at McGill, Martha Crago, a kind of a, what can I say, returnee from somewhere else, has been very much involved. Of course, she was part of the Naylor Report and is very much involved in this, and I think we will have some leadership there at the level of the university. And she says all the right things, she knows the right people, and unfortunately she couldn't be here today, one, because she's not officially part of McGill yet, till July 1st, and second is the McGill management does have a retreat today, which I think a principal has also had. So just to sum up the day, my second favorite Twitterite after Jim is happens to be the President of the United States. And, not to define Kofifi, but I think Kofifi really means this, means let's make Canada great again for research and development, or research and innovation. I think this would be a great sort of simple message, and certainly Donald gets it over in very simple ways. I wouldn't do it at 4 in the morning, but it may be trying to sell that message to our politicians. A simple message might sort of work. I think the other thing that comes out of this is that diversity is our strength. Although l'union fait la force, but unity is important, but we should have diversity in the ways that we approach. We would have the same message, but the students, the trainees, the professors, whoever, people involved in the research enterprise should approach in different ways. Obviously, we're important, our relation, with the politicians is very important. You know, who can make that best case? I think the case is that the next generation is going to be able to do that next generation of professors is going to be able to do that very well, because it fits very much with the mentality of the present government, and that's great. And they've done a great yearly career researchers have done a fantastic job of sort of showing us the way to go. But we need to have diversity too. If you look at, as I said earlier, if you look at the AI investment right now, you can trace that right back to Jim Basile, BlackBerry, and whatever. And that's an important investment in research, in invest research, that we'd like to see the government make in lots of other sectors too. So our approach to government, apart from getting our mothers to write letters, it should be diverse, you know. But with the same message, we'd like to see Canada as #1 research nation, okay? So thanks very much for coming. I really want to thank the panelists. It's been really enlightening and fantastic to see the energy and the dedication they're putting into this. Let's try and emulate them as well. Thank you very much for coming.